Hey guys, tonight, we're heading somewhere you've likely dreamed of visiting, but probably not like this Las Vegas, Nevada. But instead of the flashing lights and roaring casinos, I want you to picture a dim hotel room off the strip curtains, drawn tightly against the relentless desert sun. The hum of an aging air conditioner and a lingering smell of bleach that doesn't quite mask something else. Something faint, musty, organic. There's a reason they say what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Some things were never meant to be remembered, let alone uncovered. And some rooms, well, they never really let go of the people who stay in them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The hotel was called the Desert Palms Inn. Not the kind of place that shows up on travel blogs or influencer reels. It sat tucked behind a defunct diner on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering with an exhausted buzz, half the letters perpetually dark. If you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't stop. If you did, you probably wouldn't stay. But Mason had never been the superstitious type. After a 16-hour drive from Colorado, with 2 car trouble stops and a cracked phone screen, all he wanted was a bed, a shower, and silence. The online listing said $49 a night, and the faded front desk sign matched it. He checked in from behind smudged glass, while the clerk, a leathery man with a dry cough and a stare too long to be polite, handed him a rusted brass key marked Room 238. "You got the whole floor to yourself tonight," the man said without smiling. "Housekeeping don't come till Tuesday." Mason managed a nod. He was too tired to notice the way the man didn't meet his eyes when he said it. Room 238 was up 2 flights of cracked tile stairs. No elevator. The hall was narrow and low-ceilinged, smelling faintly of mildew and overcooked onions. The room itself had that stale familiarity of 100 identical motel nights, scratchy comforter square lampshades, discolored mini fridge humming in the corner. The only thing that stood out was the cold. The AC unit in the window rattled non-stop, spitting air colder than it should have in this heat. Mason turned the knob and fiddled with it, but it kept pumping. He considered unplugging it, but the idea of shutting off the only thing working made him uneasy. He dropped his bag near the dresser and kicked off his shoes. As he collapsed onto the bed, something in the frame gave a low groan beneath him. Normal, he figured. Old springs, old everything. It wasn't until later, somewhere between half asleep and just barely dreaming, that the smell reached him. He'd been drifting when it curled up from under the mattress. Not sharp like rot, not sour like mold, but a thick, earthy odor, like dried blood on old wood. Subtle, but insistent. He blinked into the darkness, confused at first, then slowly sat up. The room was dark. The only light came from the hallway where the door was closed but not sealed. A thin line of yellow crept beneath it. The AC hummed louder now, an offbeat rattle that scraped slightly at the end of each cycle. Mason stood wavering and crouched beside the bed. He pulled back the sheet and sniffed. Nothing unusual. He crouched lower, hesitated, then lifted the corner of the bed skirt. He expected dust, maybe a dropped sock or a forgotten pair of shoes from the last guest. Instead, he saw a shadow that didn't belong, rectangular, still, pressed flat against the carpet like something or someone had once been there long enough to leave a permanent stain. But it wasn't just a stain. It was an outline, a human outline. Even in the dark, the shape was unmistakable. Arms tight at the sides, legs slightly apart. The suggestion of a face just barely discernible in the matted fibers of the carpet. No color, just absence. A place where the air felt wrong. Mason staggered back, his heart suddenly pounding. He flicked on the bedside lamp. Nothing changed. The shape was still there. No body, no blood. But something had left its imprint. Something heavy, something human. He backed into the dresser, knocking a drawer halfway open. Inside, tucked beneath a forgotten room service menu, was a folded photograph, faded and curling at the edges. He picked it up. The image was blurry, poorly lit, but clear enough to make out the same room. Room 238. Same dresser. Same curtain pattern. And in the corner of the photo, half visible under the edge of the bed, a pale hand, limp, fingers curled slightly as if they'd tried once to hold on to something. Mason dropped the photo, and that's when he noticed the hum of the AC had stopped, and the silence beneath it felt wrong, thick, alert. Listening, he didn't move. Just stood there, the photo at his feet, the shadow beneath the bed, not quite fading under the lamp's yellow light. Somewhere in the walls, a sound began, a soft scratching, distant, as if something remembered being trapped. And maybe Mason thought whatever it was had never left. Maybe it had only sunk deeper, waiting. Mason didn't sleep. Not really. He dozed in 30-second increments, sitting upright in the single armchair beside the window, one foot planted firmly on the floor, the other leg trembling just slightly, like his body had decided to run without telling him. Outside, the Vegas lights blinked distantly, a garish glitter that had no warmth. The Desert Palms Inn was tucked far enough away from the strip that the silence felt alien, like the world had gone on without it. The shadow under the bed never moved, but it didn't fade either. Every so often, Mason would glance toward it, half hoping the light had changed, that his eyes had made a mistake. But it remained stark and flat against the cheap beige carpet, as if someone had sunk into the fibers and left behind the shape of their departure. Or maybe their resistance. When the sun finally crept up, it came weak and filtered, barely touching the room. Mason showered, but the water never quite got hot. He scrubbed hard, his skin flushed from friction, but the smell lingered. That faint organic note clung to his clothes, his hair, the skin under his nails. Like dust soaked in old breath, he left the room just after 9 a.m., locking the door behind him with more force than necessary. The hallway was empty, lit by buzzing fluorescents, their flicker barely noticeable unless you stared long enough. The front desk clerk wasn't at the counter. The bell didn't work. He waited 5 minutes before scribbling a note. Room 238 needs to be checked. Something's wrong. He didn't sign it. He drove toward the strip, trying to shake off the weight in his chest. The city was awake now. People pouring out of hotels with plastic cups and hand taxis, honking everything, pulsing with color and movement. Mason grabbed breakfast from a nameless diner, ate without tasting, and tried to forget, but something followed, not visibly, not in a way he could explain. It was like the sense of being watched, but gentler, quieter. Not a threat, a presence. By the time he returned to room 238, just before dusk, he felt no better. The hallway light still flickered. The room still smelled faintly wrong. The photo he'd found, the one with the hand, was gone, and the outline beneath the bed still there, unchanged. He didn't unpack. Just sat again in the armchair this time, dragging it closer to the door, as if proximity to escape would change anything. At 10:47 p.m., he heard movement, not from the room, from beneath it. It wasn't loud, just the soft shift of fibers, like a body shifting weight against the carpet, not rising, but stretching. He stared at the shadow and saw something impossible. The edges flickered, not outward, inward, as if the darkness were drawing itself tighter, reshaping the form like breath. He stood backed toward the window. No footsteps, no dragging sound, just that silent flicker, barely perceptible like the heat distortion off pavement. Then came the knock, not on the door. From inside the wall, just behind the bed, 3 slow knocks, measured, even hollow. He stood frozen for a full minute, breath locked, every muscle tight. The knocks didn't return. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, unsure if he was leaving or just catching air. The corridor was empty, silent, save for the soft hum of an old vending machine at the far end. Then something strange caught his eye. Room 239. The door was open. Barely. Mason blinked. He'd passed that door a dozen times. Never saw it open. Never heard a sound. Now, it stood ajar just enough for a sliver of shadow to leak out. His instinct said turn away, but something else pulled him closer. Not curiosity, not fear. Recognition. He crossed the hallway slowly, bare feet against tile, heart pounding. He paused at the door and listened. Nothing. He reached out, pushed it open. The room was identical to his own. Same layout, same furniture, but colder. There was no suitcase, no toothbrush by the sink, no signs of anyone staying there, except for the bed. Beneath it, a dark shape, just like the one in his room. Same outline, same position. Only here, something was different. A thin trail of dust led from the shadow beneath the bed to the center of the carpet. A smudge, as if someone or something had crawled out. He backed away. The bathroom door creaked. He hadn't touched it, hadn't even looked toward it, but now it opened slowly, revealing only darkness within. And from the void, the smell returned. Stronger now, thicker. Mason turned and ran down the hall, down the stairs, past the broken front desk, out into the dry night air. He didn't stop until he reached his car. He drove without thinking. When he finally looked in the rearview mirror, expecting the hotel to vanish in the distance, it wasn't there. Just a long stretch of road and an empty lot, as if the Desert Palms Inn had never existed, or had never let anyone leave before. Mason drove for nearly an hour before he realized he hadn't spoken. Not a word. Not even a muttered curse under his breath. The silence inside the car had become something thick, more than just absence of sound. He kept his eyes on the road, half expecting the hotel to reappear in the mirror. It didn't. Only a stretch of empty highway, glittering faintly in the glare of his taillights, baking slowly under the night heat. He passed neon signs for all-night gas stations, blinking billboards, advertising cheap buffets and pawn shops. The kind of places that only existed after midnight, when the rest of the city stopped pretending to care. At a truck stop just outside North Las Vegas, Mason pulled over and sat in the parking lot with the engine running. The clock read 12:36 a.m. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. The shadow was still with him, not visible, not chasing, but clinging. He could feel it in the air around him, just behind his shoulder. A pressure, a knowing. The smell still clung to his shirt. He rolled down the window, hoping to replace it with the sour diesel breeze and warm exhaust. It didn't help. Inside the convenience store, the overhead lights buzzed like hornets. He grabbed coffee and a protein bar without making eye contact with the cashier. But just before he reached the door, something caught his eye. A corkboard pinned with fading flyers and business cards. One of them had a photo of the Desert Palms Inn. Not a drawing, not a logo, a real photo. Crumpled and stained. Room 238's door visible barely ajar. Below it, in red marker, "Do not stay. If you've stayed, contact us." There was a phone number scrawled beneath. No name. He tore the flyer from the board and stuffed it in his pocket. Back in the car, the flyer vibrated faintly in his hand as if it carried a charge. Mason stared at the number, 702-395-7741. His first instinct was to ignore it. Burn it. Drive until he forgot. But something deeper, a thread of dread mixed with obligation, made him unlock his phone and dial. The phone rang twice. Then a voice answered. Female, tired, low. "You stayed in the room." Mason swallowed. "Yeah. How did you... You saw it," she interrupted. "Under the bed." A pause. Then she asked the question he'd been avoiding all night. "Did it move?" He hesitated. "Not exactly." "Then you're still early." "It hasn't attached yet." He pressed the phone harder to his ear. "What the hell is it?" Another pause. Then she said, "It's what's left. Of someone. Or maybe a lot of someone's. A memory-grown teeth. You saw the outline." "Yeah. They always leave an impression. But sometimes the impression gets hungry. Some people just feel it. Others feed it. It chooses." Mason stared at his dashboard. The car interior felt suddenly smaller, the air hotter. She continued. How long were you in the room? 2 nights, he said. Almost. You need to burn the clothes. You can't go back, even if you think you can. I saw another room, Mason said. 239. Same shadow. That room's always empty, she said. Always has been. If it opened to you, that means it knows your name now. His stomach turned. You should come see us, she said. There are others. Survivors, sort of. People the room let go. Where? Look behind the flyer, she said. Mason unfolded it. On the back, in the same red ink Pineview Motel, Tonopah. Ask for Lena. He looked at the clock. Nearly 1 a.m. I'll come tomorrow, she exhaled. Just don't sleep in your car. If it moves again, you'll wake up somewhere you don't remember entering. The line went dead. Mason sat in the parking lot for a long time. The smell hadn't faded, and now it was thicker, seeping not from the clothes but from the vents in the dashboard, as though something had curled up inside the car while he was on the phone. He looked over at the passenger seat. For just a moment, the upholstery seemed indented, slightly compressed, as if someone was sitting there, watching, waiting, and beneath it, the faintest outline of a handprint. Mason didn't sleep. He drove, northbound headlights cutting through empty desert roads, the sky above swollen with stars that pulsed like quiet warnings. The kind of stars you don't see in the city, too clear, too close. He drove because stopping felt like surrender. He drove because he didn't know what else to do. Tonopah was 3 hours away. A forgotten town halfway between nowhere and somewhere else. He'd never been, but he'd heard the name. A place known more for its ghost stories than its attractions. Abandoned mines, cracked windows, locals who didn't make eye contact. It felt appropriate. He reached the Pineview Motel just after 4 a.m., the sky softening at the edges. It looked like every motel he'd ever stayed in low-slung, peeling paint. The sign buzzed half-lit in pink and blue neon. But this one was different. It didn't pretend to be anything. It didn't smile. It just waited. Mason parked and sat for a moment, staring at the reception office. The light inside was on. Not bright, not warm. Just enough. He stepped out into the cold air, stretching his legs. As he crossed the lot, he noticed something strange. None of the other cars had dust on them, not even a thin layer. They looked clean, like they had just arrived, or hadn't moved in years. The door jingled as he entered the office. A woman looked up from behind the counter. Late 30s, dark hair and a braid, eyes that didn't blink as fast as they should have. She didn't greet him, just stared. "You're Mason," she said. He nodded. "Lena," she gestured toward the chair in the corner. "Sit. Don't touch the candy dish." He hadn't noticed the candy dish until she said it. It sat on the counter beside the register. Glass, filled with something dark. Hard to tell if it was candy or old teeth. He sat. "You feel it still?" Lena asked. Mason nodded. "Yes." "Then you're not safe yet. Most people aren't marked this soon. It must have liked you." "I don't want it to like me," he said. She looked at him carefully, then reached under the counter and pulled out a shoebox. Inside, Polaroids. Hundreds of them. She set them down with a soft thud. The smell of old paper and mildew rose up between them. "Look," she said. He did. Each photo was of a room. Different motels. Some clean, some wrecked. Always the same angle down toward the floor beside a bed, and in every one a shadow. Some clearer than others. Some barely there. Some with limbs. Some with faces blurred out. People who stayed, she said. Most didn't make it past a week. Some never checked out. Some came back changed. Mason reached toward one photo, paused, then picked it up. His hand shook. It was room 238. His room 238. He recognized the water stain on the wall, the angle of the chair, the chipped edge of the table. But in this photo, there was no outline beneath the bed. There was a shape sitting on the bed instead, back turned, head slightly tilted, long hair, unmoving. Mason looked up. This can't be. This is from before me," Lena nodded. Room 238 always leaves a new mark after each visitor. The shape changes, but only a little. Who is this? She was silent. Then finally, her name was Marlene. She stayed too long. Tried to bring someone else with her. You don't do that. The room punishes those who try to take what doesn't belong. Mason felt cold bloom in his stomach. What happens if it follows me? Lena reached into the drawer again and pulled out something wrapped in black cloth. She unwrapped it carefully. A key, old, brass. The number had been scratched off. Room 0, she said. Doesn't exist on any floor, but it's always there when you need it. If it starts to follow you in dreams, you go there. Sleep in that room. Don't ask questions. Don't look under the bed. He stared at the key. How do I find it? You don't, she said. It finds you. If you're lucky. Mason took the key. It felt too warm in his hand. Lena leaned forward, eyes sharp. You need to make peace with the fact that you opened a door most people never find. It saw you. It left its shape in you. That doesn't go away. He stood slowly. So what now? I just wait. No, she said. You remember. Remember what? She hesitated, then said, what it was like before the room chose you. He turned to leave. At the door he paused and looked back. But Lena was already flipping the sign to closed, and the candy dish was empty. Mason didn't check into a room that night. He couldn't. Not after Lena handed him a key to a place that didn't exist. He drove again out of Tonopah and into the creeping edge of the desert where the road turned black against the early sun and the shadows didn't fall where they should. He kept the radio off, afraid of hearing static, afraid of hearing something between the stations that shouldn't be there. For hours nothing changed, and then something did. It started with the mile markers. At first, they counted forward as they should. Then, after mile 213, he noticed one repeat. Then again. 213. 3 times in a row. On the 4th pass, the marker was gone. In its place, a bent, rusted sign nailed into the earth that simply read, Room 0, vacancy. His hands clenched the wheel. He didn't slow down, didn't dare. But 20 minutes later, he found himself circling a small cul-de-sac he didn't remember turning into. It wasn't on any map. The GPS had stopped functioning 2 hours earlier. The air was different here, still dry, but heavy, like being inside a mouth about to speak. And at the end of the loop, a building, 1 story, no name, no windows. A single black door with the number 0 carved directly into the wood. No handle, just a keyhole. Mason sat in the car a long time before moving. The key Lena gave him felt heavier now. He held it in his palm, then stepped out, feeling the desert crackle under his boots. As he approached the door, something in the back of his skull pulsed a soft ringing. Not quite pain, but not peace either. He slid the key in and turned it. The door swung inward without resistance. The air inside was cold. Not AC cold, not desert night cold. Cold like stone beneath the earth. Cold like absence. The room was barely furnished. A bed with no sheets. A mirror nailed to the wall with its surface painted black. A lamp in the corner that gave off no light. And on the floor, carved deeply into the concrete, the outline, same shape, same size, arms by the sides, legs together, but this time something new just beneath the neck of the figure etched so deep it had torn the cement. I see you. Mason stepped back. The door clicked shut behind him. No lock, no handle on the inside. He was in, and something else was already in with him. The temperature dropped again. He sat on the edge of the bed because there was nowhere else to go. Then from the corner of his eye he saw it. The outline shimmered, not moved, shimmered, as if reacting to him, or remembering him. He stood, crossed the room, knelt beside it. The concrete was smooth inside the carved figure. Too smooth, not like the rest of the floor. He touched it. The chill bit into his skin. He pulled back sharply, and where his fingers had been, moisture began to bead. Condensation. No sweat. The outline was warm now. He backed away, The lamp in the corner flicked on, faint, amber, and on the far wall the black mirror began to show something, not a reflection. A hallway, narrow, familiar, room 238. He saw the bed, the shape beneath it, and then his own face, staring down at the shadow, frozen, mouth slightly open, watching himself, and then the shape moved. In the mirror, the figure beneath the bed twisted slowly. Its head turned, its hand reached toward the mason in the reflection. And as it reached, the mason in the mirror backed away, but the real mason, this one, stood frozen in place, eyes wide. The light from the lamp grew brighter, the mirror rippled, and the outline on the floor began to fill, not with shadow, with liquid, thick, slow, like tar. It rose from nothing, bleeding into form. Arms, shoulders, a neck, a mouth yawning wide, but silent. He stumbled back to the door and twisted the knob. There was no knob, only smooth wood. The black mirror pulsed again, now showing not the room, but a motel parking lot, the Pine View, and Lena staring directly into it, and she mouthed only one word: run. Mason's breath caught in his throat. His body reacted before his mind could form a plan. He pounded on the door, fists slamming into the smooth surface, expecting it to splinter, expecting some resistance, anything. But the wood didn't move. It didn't echo. It absorbed sound like a sponge, deadening the panic that surged through his veins. Behind him, the shape on the floor continued to fill the liquid, not spilling over the edges, but rising in perfect obedience to the outline as though it were always meant to be there. It shimmered black and viscous under the low amber light, casting no reflection, no shadow, only depth. He turned toward the mirror again. Lena was still there, still staring, but now the mirror began to flicker like static, but wetter, like something inside it was gurgling between images. For a second, the Pine View Motel disappeared, and another hallway emerged. Narrower, older, brick walls and candlelight. Then a hotel room, one he didn't recognize. Then a cellar, a wooden chair, a figure bound to it, head slumped. And then for just a moment, a reflection of Mason's own face again, but this time behind a cracked motel window, as if he were standing outside of himself, peering in through glass warped by time. He backed away from the mirror, but there was no space left to retreat. The bed blocked one wall. The door was sealed. The lamp hissed, and the figure rising from the outline was now nearly complete, its chest heaving softly, its head tilted slightly upward. Its skin looked unfinished, like clay left out too long. Patches of it shimmered with moisture, while other parts looked parched and cracking, splitting like dry earth. Its eyes hadn't opened, but Mason could feel them forming. He circled the room, pacing like a caged animal, hand grazing every seam of the walls, pressing at corners, dragging nails across the floorboards, hoping something would creak, give reveal a gap. But the room was silent and perfect in its wrongness. It didn't just hold him, it knew him. The dimensions were too exact. The bed, the exact height of his knees. The temperature dropping every time he breathed too loudly. Even the flicker of the light matched his pulse. He pulled the key from his pocket and jabbed it into the wall anywhere, but it didn't pierce. The metal bent with a soft hiss, like it had no place here, like the room had accepted him, but not the escape. And then the figure moved, just a finger twitching against the floor. A spasm. The sound it made was wet and soft, like a sponge dragged across glass. The limbs began to stretch first, slow, then smoother, like joints remembered their purpose. Mason pressed himself into the corner, one foot braced against the wall, the other ready to bolt, even though there was nowhere to bolt to. He didn't scream. He couldn't. The room didn't allow noise. His chest tightened with the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts, like the walls were pressing them back down his throat. The figure was sitting up now, no longer flat, no longer just a shape. It turned its head not with curiosity but precision, and though it had no eyes, it looked directly at him. The mouth opened, wider than it should have, unhinged, not in a scream, not in hunger, but in recognition, like it knew him, like it had always known him. From the mirror came the sound of wind howling, high-pitched, spinning like a tornado through narrow pipes. The flickering image snapped back to room 238. Mason saw the bed again, the one he had slept in, the stain, the photo, and then the camera perspective twisted, turning downward. And beneath the bed, his face, looking up, mouth open, eyes wide, pale hand reaching out from underneath. The mirror shattered inward, but no glass fell. Instead, the void it left behind yawned wider, revealing not the wall but a corridor made of flickering motel rooms, all identical, all endless. Room 238 repeated down both sides, numbers bleeding into each other. Doors opening into darkness. Footsteps echoing from nowhere. The figure in the room now stood. It was full height, taller than Mason. Its skin hissed and crackled. Its face was unfinished, swirling like wet paint trapped between strokes. But its shape was his, almost. It stepped toward him with a quiet grace, and Mason realized too late that his shadow had disappeared from the floor. It wasn't beside him. It wasn't beneath him. It had joined the thing. The light blinked once, twice, and the door behind him unlocked with a faint click. Mason spun and yanked it open. Beyond it, blackness. No hallway, no desert, only cold-pressing dark. But it was a way out, or a way through. He looked back one last time. The figure had raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed into the mirror corridor, then lowered it toward Mason. An invitation, or a command. Mason stepped through the doorway into the dark, and the door closed behind him without a sound. The darkness Mason stepped into wasn't simply the absence of light. It was something far denser, like the inside of a tunnel carved through wet soil, or the void left behind when something living is hollowed out. His feet hit solid ground, but it didn't sound like floorboards or concrete. The material beneath him gave slightly with each step, like old carpet soaked in water, soft and absorbing. And though he could see nothing, he felt movement currents brushing past his arms, rustling the hair at the nape of his neck. Not wind, not air. Something closer to breath. Something watching. He held his hands out in front of him as he moved forward, counting steps like a lifeline, 12, 20, 30. The silence wasn't truly silent. There were sounds faint and dissonant, like the low whisper of a television left on in another room. Snatches of static, then laughter, dry-aged laughter, followed by a sound like someone dragging a coin slowly across a metal sink. Mason blinked, trying to adjust, but there was no shift in the black. His own hands might as well not exist. Even his breath came quieter now, like the space itself was muffling him, pressing inward. Then light, dim, unnatural like candlelight, underwater. It came from nowhere specific, but slowly began to paint vague shapes around him. He stood in a corridor now long and impossibly narrow, the ceiling low enough that he felt it threatening to scrape the top of his head. Doors lined the hall on both sides, identical wooden, each marked with the same number, 238. No locks, no knobs, just the number etched deep into every panel as if burned in with a searing rod. Mason reached toward the first door on the left hand, trembling fingertips brushing the grain. It was warm, too warm. He pressed his palm to it, and it pulsed faintly beneath his skin, once then again like something breathing slowly inside. He backed away and turned to the door opposite. It was identical, but cold this time, the surface dry and flaking like long-forgotten wallpaper. He moved on, walking slowly down the corridor. The light never changed, but the air shifted. With each step, the scent around him grew stronger, not rot, not mildew, but something sterile and wrong, like hospital bleach mixed with old flesh. The floor beneath him began to resist, clinging slightly to the soles of his shoes. He stopped. A sound came from behind the next door, a soft knock. Not rhythmic, not aggressive, just searching. Then another knock, this time from the opposite side. He turned in a slow circle. The doors behind him remained shut, but now all of them had started to hum, just slightly, like tuning forks vibrating against unseen strings. A pressure built behind his eyes, the air thickening. He clutched the brass key in his pocket, though he knew it wouldn't work here. This wasn't room 0 anymore. This was deeper. The corridor stretched longer now, pulling toward a vanishing point where the light grew thinner. The walls began to lean inward ever so slightly, not visibly but perceptibly, as if the entire hallway had grown tired of its shape and was slowly sagging under its own weight. He forced himself forward, driven not by bravery, but by instinct. The kind of instinct that tells a person to run toward a voice in a dream, even when every logical thought tells them not to. His fingers brushed the doors as he passed, each one reacting differently. One cold one, warm one, pulsing, one sticky one, slick with condensation. Every door remembered something, and Mason began to realize they weren't just doors, they were witnesses. Then suddenly one was open, just a crack. Room 238, again. The interior was dark, but something inside had moved. A subtle shift of shape. He stepped closer, heart hammering, and peered inside. The bed was empty, no outline, no stain. Instead, on the floor directly beneath it, something small, a box. Worn wooden, bound with black thread. Mason hesitated, then stepped over the threshold. The moment he crossed, the air changed. Quieter, cooler, as if stepping through a film between states of being. He knelt, picked up the box. It was surprisingly light. The thread unwound easily, like it had been waiting for him. Inside, photos, not Polaroids. Old photographs curled at the edges. The black and white faded almost to gray. He flipped through them. Each one showed a different version of room 238. Same furniture, same layout. But the people inside were different. Sometimes a man, sometimes a woman, sometimes a pair, lovers, siblings, strangers. Always in bed, always asleep. Until the last photo. In it, Mason saw himself, asleep in room 238. Except he hadn't taken that photo. He hadn't seen anyone that could have. In the image, a figure crouched beneath the bed, only half visible. Just an arm, a shoulder, part of a face. Eyes entirely black. Watching him, Mason dropped the photo. It fluttered to the carpet. The moment it hit the ground, the bed creaked above him. Once, twice. Then the mattress dipped. Not quickly, slowly, as if someone was crawling into it from underneath. Mason bolted upright. The open door behind him now showed only a blank wall. No hallway, no light. And behind him, the bed's frame groaned again. He turned just enough to see an outline forming again beneath the sheets. Same shape, same pose. But this time the chest rose and fell. It was breathing. He stepped backward, pulse screaming, hand on the wall, trying to find any seam, any crack. The figure under the covers shifted. Then in a voice that didn't sound like one more, a memory of a voice dragged across static, it said, "We remember you." And the lights went out. The darkness returned, like a blanket soaked in ice water, immediate, total, and clinging. Mason froze, pressing his back to the wall, trying to slow his breathing. But the air felt too thick, too weighted, as if it were saturated with the breath of the thing in the bed. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It was full brimming with awareness, as though the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. Somewhere close, the sound of sheets shifting sent a jagged ripple through him, not the sound of someone tossing in sleep. This was deliberate. A slow, heavy movement, like the kind made when someone turns to face you in the dark. Mason's hands fumbled along the wall. The smooth plaster beneath his fingers was soft, almost damp. Then a sudden shudder passed through it, as if the room had exhaled. The voice, if it could be called, that lingered in his mind. "We remember you." The words hadn't been spoken in any normal sense. They were pressed into him, bypassing ears and logic. It was like being whispered to from the inside of a dream you couldn't wake from. He didn't dare turn his back on the bed. Instead, inch by inch, he began moving sideways, hands searching for a doorframe, a corner, anything solid. But the room had changed. The dimensions were off. The wall was longer now, stretching beyond where it should end. The corners didn't align. It was as if the space had unfolded subtly while the lights were out, and now Mason was inside something new. Or perhaps something older. Then the mattress creaked again, followed by the sharp, brittle sound of fingernails grazing fabric. A single long drag across the blanket. Not hurried, not threatening, just present. A sound that said, "I'm here. I never left." A memory returned unbidden him as a child, hiding under the covers during thunderstorms, believing if he stayed perfectly still, the dark couldn't touch him. Now, the roles had reversed. He was no longer the child under the covers. He was the thing being watched. Then a low hum began. It came from beneath the bed, soft at first, almost a vibration in the floorboards. Then it grew a chorus of mismatched tones, like voices humming different lullabies, overlapping and discordant. It wasn't loud, but it shook something deep inside Mason's chest. Each note seemed tuned to an exact frequency of fear. His knees gave out. He slid down the wall, crouching, low eyes scanning the dark for any change in shape, any shift in outline. The humming stopped, instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. And from the bed, the blankets began to rise, slowly at first, then all at once, lifting into the air, not like fabric, but like a sail catching wind. Something underneath stirred. The silhouette was unmistakable. Human, but not quite. Too tall, too thin. The proportions were wrong, subtle but jarring, as though someone had taken the memory of a person and stretched it just slightly out of place. It sat up, and in the low flicker of light that returned barely more than a breath's glow, Mason saw its face. No eyes, just smooth pale skin where they should be. The nose was small, nearly absent, and the mouth was too wide, too still. It didn't smile. It didn't blink. It only stared, though Mason knew it couldn't see. And yet he felt its gaze lock onto him with a precision that eyes couldn't match. He tried to speak, to scream, to move, but his body wouldn't obey. The weight of the moment pinned him down like gravity had increased tenfold. The figure cocked its head slightly, as if curious. Then without a sound it stood, feet never touching the floor, hovering just a breath above it. It began to glide forward, arms limp at its sides, mouth unmoving. Mason forced himself up, crawling backward until his hand struck something metal, a knob, a door, not where it should be. He didn't care. He turned it and fell through. He landed hard on tile, cold, real. Lights buzzed above, fluorescence. He blinked. The hallway of the Pineview Motel stretched before him, as if he had been spit out back into the world. But it wasn't right. Everything was silent, too silent. The doors on either side were all open now. Room after room, the doors stood wide, but there were no lights on inside. Just shadowed entryways, and in each one, a shape stood barely visible. Still. Watching. Figures. Thin, tall, identical, one in each room, all facing him. He turned to run, but found only a mirror behind him, a full-length mirror that hadn't been there before. And in it he saw not himself, but the figure from the bed, standing where he should have been, mouth widening, arms rising, its skin cracking at the seams. And then the glass began to bleed. Blood ran from the corners of the mirror in slow, deliberate rivulets, dark and impossibly thick, tracing down the glass like veins trying to escape their own form. Mason stumbled back, the soles of his shoes skidding across the cracked motel tiles as he watched his not reflection raise one spindly, too long finger and drag it across the inside of the glass. It left a trail neither smudge nor scratch, but a glowing red line that pulsed like an open wound. Letters began to form, not carved but emerging from inside the mirror as though the glass itself was bleeding words. "Welcome back." Mason's breath hitched. That wasn't possible. He had never been here before, at least not consciously. But even as he thought it, fragments of memory surfaced like splinters breaking skin, a room that smelled like dust and rain. The pressure of eyes under a bed frame. Whispers behind a wall he could never find again. Images too fractured to make sense, too vivid to be imagined. His legs finally obeyed, and he pushed himself upright, staggering away from the mirror, just as the figure within reached toward him. With a hand that did not meet the surface, it slipped through like the glass was a thin veil of smoke. Panic clawed at his throat. He turned and fled down the hallway, past the rows of open rooms and the unmoving shapes inside. None of them followed, but each turned slowly as he passed, their eyeless faces pivoting to track him, their mouths just beginning to open in silent, agonized unison. The humming started again, faint harmonic, rising in layers, as if sung by 1,000 throats without tongues. His pulse pounded beneath it, a private drum of dread that urged him forward. He burst through the lobby doors of the Pine View and staggered into the morning light. Only it wasn't morning anymore. The sun hung low on the horizon like a sick, jaundiced eye, casting long shadows that bent at unnatural angles. The sky was tinged green at the edges, and the street outside the motel was empty, not just of people or cars, but of sound. No birds, no wind. Even the air stood still. Mason looked around, disoriented. The parking lot was the same, the sign flickering overhead, but the world around it had changed. Buildings beyond the street had grown unfamiliar architecture wrong in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. Windows too tall. Roofs sloped at impossible gradients. A church steeple where he was sure a laundromat had been. The Pine View hadn't sent him back. It had pulled the world forward, or pulled him somewhere else. He walked toward his car. It sat exactly where he left it, but there were deep fingerprints pressed into the glass, 5 long, narrow smudges on the passenger window, oily and unmistakably human in shape, but too large, too low to make sense. He paused. The handle was cold, colder than it should have been in the Nevada heat. He opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, the upholstery stiff and dry beneath him. The key fit, but the ignition didn't respond. No click. No lights. The dashboard remained dark. The world beyond the windshield felt distant, like a photograph printed on wet fabric. Then behind him in the rearview mirror movement. He didn't want to look, but he had to, at first. Nothing. Just the back seat, dim and empty. Then, like ink spreading through water, a darkness bled into view. A shadow hunched and twitching slightly, the shape of shoulders hunched forward, of arms folded inward as if clutching something close to its chest. The figure leaned forward, slowly, deliberately, until Mason could see the shape of a mouth forming in the shadows, wide and lipless teeth, too many, too small. The car filled with the sound of breathing, not his, slow, rattling like air dragged through wet paper. And then the mouth in the mirror moved. It didn't speak. It exhaled. The sound hit his ear like a whisper underwater. "Don't wake them." Mason flinched, turning sharply in his seat, but the back was empty. The air was thick again, sour and damp. His hand shot to the door handle, and he threw it open, tumbling out into the gravel lot, palms scraping against the ground. The sun was lower now, impossibly low, sinking in fast forward, casting the entire motel in a warped orange glow. He looked around wildly, heart in his throat, chest heaving. And that's when he saw it. Every room at the Pineview now had its door open, not wide, just enough. And in the shadows of each room, a shape stood, watching, waiting. He turned and ran, gravel crunching underfoot, not knowing where he was going, only that he had to move. Past the broken vending machine, past the sagging fence at the back of the lot, into the alley that wrapped around the rear of the building. He skidded to a stop. There was another door, one he hadn't seen before. No markings, no knob, but it looked right, like it belonged, like it was his. A whisper trickled down his spine, not words but memory, a feeling. He had opened this door before, long ago, in a place that didn't exist. He reached out. The wood was warm. Mason's fingers hovered above the door, barely touching the surface, and even that slightest contact sent something vibrating up through his arm, like a sound too deep to hear, but felt in the bones. He pressed his palm flat against the wood. It pulsed once beneath his hand. Not mechanically, not like something alive, but like memory. A memory that wasn't his. Something old, something that remembered being touched in exactly this way before. The air around him stiffened, windless and dry, holding its breath. Behind him, the Pineview was silent again. The open doors remained ajar, each of them dark slits in the motel's facade, filled with standing shapes, too still, too silent, too symmetrical. But Mason didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew if he did, the figures might not stay still. He pushed. The door opened with no creak, no resistance. It simply gave way, as if his presence had always been its price. Inside, the light was dim like dusk, trapped in a glass jar, neither day nor night. The room was narrow-walled with unfinished wood beams and lined with dusty mirrors, each one slightly cracked in a different place. The floor was uneven, scattered with old newspapers and faded motel keychains, most with no numbers. A single table stood in the center, wooden round and stained with the outlines of long dried rings from countless glasses. On it rested a single object, a rotary phone, black and spotless, incongruously pristine, against the dust and decay around it. Mason stepped inside, and the door closed behind him, not slammed, not even clicked. It simply ceased being open. He turned, but the knob had vanished. The wood where it had been was smooth, like the idea of an exit had been erased. He took a breath. The air was thicker here, warmer. It pressed against his skin with invisible hands. Every mirror reflected him, but differently, one slightly younger one, older one, staring straight back, while his real eyes darted nervously from corner to corner. Then the phone rang, a single shrill note that seemed to slice through the air and go on too long, too sharp for the room, too loud for his ears. Mason stared at it. It rang again. He hesitated, then picked it up. He didn't say hello. He didn't have to. The voice on the other end spoke first. Calm, female, familiar in that unnerving way of déjà vu. You left the bed, she said. He didn't reply. You weren't supposed to look. Still silence. You opened the room that doesn't belong. That makes you one of them now. His throat tightened. Who are you? You knew me once, the voice replied. But not here. Not like this. What is this place? He asked, fingers gripping the receiver too tightly. What do you want from me? There was a pause. Then, we don't want anything. We remember. Remember what? You. The line went dead. Mason kept the phone to his ear for another moment, waiting for some click, some sign it was a prank or a mistake. But the silence that followed was absolute. He set the receiver down. The room had changed, subtly at first. The light had grown dimmer, the air thicker, the mirrors now showing scenes behind him that weren't real, at least not of this room. In one, he saw Lena standing at the Pineview front desk, her hands bleeding from her palms as she gripped a photograph. In another room, 238 as it once was, untouched, The bed pristine, the stain not yet there. And in the mirror closest to him, something moved. Not him, but a figure standing just over his shoulder. He turned. Nothing. But the reflection showed it clearly. A shape, cloaked in shadow. Tall and thin mouth, stretched wide in a mockery of human expression. Mason stepped away, but the mirror followed. Not physically, it didn't move, but its angle shifted as though bending to keep him within its frame. He turned to the next. Same thing. No matter how he moved, the figure was always just behind him, just far enough to stay undefined. The mirrors began to hum, low at first, then louder, each one vibrating with a sound that grew like feedback. Mason clutched his ears, but it didn't help. The vibration wasn't outside, it was in his bones, his blood. One by one, the mirrors began to crack deeper, fractures spiderwebbing outward from their centers. Then one shattered. Glass exploded inward, not outward, like something from the other side had pulled it in. Mason stumbled back. The wall behind the broken frame was no longer solid. It was an opening, a void. From inside, a breath emerged, and a voice that was not spoken but felt. You looked under the bed. Mason didn't run. He stepped forward, because something inside him knew it was the only way out now. He reached the edge of the mirror void, hand outstretched, and with a final exhale, he stepped through. The space on the other side wasn't a room. It wasn't a corridor or a hallway, or even a place in the way Mason understood places. It was between. A plane of suspended darkness, textured like smoke, made solid of fog that held shape without dispersing, stretching endlessly in all directions but offering no orientation. He wasn't standing anymore, at least not on anything that resembled ground. The moment he crossed the mirror's fractured boundary, gravity had turned uncertain. Not gone, but reconfigured. He floated slightly, like his body was heavier than the space allowed, like the rules here were still deciding how to apply to him. Shapes moved at the edge of his vision, blurred shadows that swirled in and out of being, forming the vague impressions of doors, staircases, outlines of chairs, motel beds, nightstands. All the shapes of familiar places, but just for a breath. Like the memory of architecture dissolving in dream. And yet, none of it felt foreign. Mason recognized it all. Somewhere inside, some part of him understood he had been here before. Not in this life, not in any life he remembered, but he had stood in this between space once, and it had not gone well. Then a voice, quiet, masculine, breathless, whispered into the space around him, "Do you want to go back?" The question came from everywhere and nowhere. He turned instinctively, but there was no source, only the folds of darkness pulling slightly away, as though observing his response. He spoke carefully. Yes. Silence. A pause. Then you must bring something with you. What? No answer. But then in front of him the fog began to churn, folding inward, condensing into form. Slowly, painfully slowly, a figure emerged. It was human-shaped, but something was wrong with its outline. Its limbs seemed too loose, like they were not attached by joints, but suggestions. Its skin, if it could be called that, was the color of wet ash. No eyes, no mouth. But still, Mason knew it was looking at him. It extended an arm, in its palm an object, a photograph. He took it without thinking. The image room 238. Again, but different. The bed was bare, the mirror intact, and in the center of the room on the floor, someone lay face down. A person. The image was too grainy to see clearly, but the hair was familiar. Dark, slightly curled. The back of a faded blue hoodie, Mason's hoodie. He turned the photo over. Words were scrawled in messy, looping letters. "You are not where you are. You are where you were." He blinked, heart stumbling in his chest. The figure in the fog stepped backward and melted away, dissolving into vapor like it had never been whole. Then the space around him brightened, not through any source of light, but by degree the shadows receding slightly, revealing a path beneath him, a surface solid enough to walk. A corridor took shape, not the one from before, but made of walls that looked like motel wallpaper over rotting wood, stitched together from mismatched parts of different rooms. Each door a different decade. Some bore claw marks, some still bled. He moved forward, one step, then another. Each footfall echoed like it traveled down a long metal pipe, resonating strangely in his chest, returning not as sound but sensation, warmth, nausea, static. The air grew heavier, denser, until he felt like walking through oil. Then he reached a door. Unlike the others, it was whole, polished, numbered 238. His pulse spiked. He didn't want to open it, but he also didn't want to be here anymore. He reached out. The doorknob was cold metal, slick with condensation. His hand trembled as he gripped it. He paused. Some part of him knew once he turned it, something fundamental would change. Something permanent. He twisted. The door opened inward. The room was quiet, still, exactly as he remembered it. The bed, the mirror, the small stain on the carpet. No one inside. Not yet. He stepped in. The moment he crossed the threshold, sound returned in a rush. A high-pitched ringing like feedback filled the air. The walls vibrated. The mirror on the wall cracked down the center, splitting his reflection clean in two. He staggered back, clutching his ears. Then, a voice behind him, not whispering this time, soft, familiar, female. "Why did you come back?" He turned and saw her, Lauren, from years ago. She stood at the center of the room barefoot, wearing the old t-shirt she used to sleep in, the one he had never thrown away. Her hair was wet, like she had just stepped out of the shower, and her eyes were wide, not afraid, but sad, heartbroken. "I tried to leave," he whispered. I didn't know." She shook her head slowly. "You saw me once, under the bed. You didn't look away." Tears welled in his eyes. "I thought I imagined it. You didn't. You woke me." The air shifted. The walls breathed. The light in the room grew dim, flickered, and then behind her, the outline on the floor began to form again. Wet, pulsing, waiting. The outline on the floor bled slowly into view, not drawn or carved, but revealed like it had always been there beneath the surface, patiently waiting for someone to notice. The fluid that formed it was darker than shadow, oily and slow-moving, gathering into the familiar shape. Head, torso, arms close to the sides, legs, straight toes pointed outward. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. Each line formed with terrifying patience, as if it knew its time had come again. Mason stood frozen in the doorway of room 238, the same room he had stayed in days ago before everything fractured. But it was different now. Not in detail, the bed, the mirror, the off-white wallpaper stained faintly with time, but in weight. The air felt pregnant with presence, like something immense sat just outside of perception, watching through the cracks. Lauren didn't move. She stood at the foot of the bed, her feet inches from the forming outline, arms wrapped loosely around herself, her expression unreadable, not ghostly, not monstrous, just sad. She looked as she had on the last morning he saw her in real life, back when she left without a word. But here now she was something else, not entirely Lauren, not entirely other. A memory stretched into flesh. "I didn't mean to wake anything." Mason whispered, his voice brittle, the words almost choking him. "I didn't know what I saw." "You saw me," she said softly, eyes still locked on the outline. That's all it took. "What is this place?" he asked. "This room. It's not just a motel, is it?" She nodded slowly, eyes distant. "No, it's a hinge, a fold, a wound, a wound." Her voice was quieter now. "There are places people make, and then there are places people leave behind. This is the second kind. You don't build wounds, you cause them. And sometimes, if the pain lingers long enough, it starts remembering on its own." Mason swallowed hard. But why this room? What happened here? She turned her head to look at him then, and for a split second, the corners of her eyes darkened, as if shadow bloomed inside her. Someone looked. Long before you. Someone refused to pretend they didn't see. They reached under the bed when they were told not to. They spoke the name, and the room remembered. It always remembers. The outline on the floor twitched. The liquid stirred again, and this time, it wasn't just forming a shape, it was lifting. A ripple beneath the surface. As if something was rising to meet its own echo, Mason backed toward the wall, instinct begging him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door behind him was gone now, or rather, it had become part of the wall painted over like it had never opened at all. He was sealed in. You have to lay down, Lauren said, and her voice was different now. Still hers, but layered with something deeper, something that vibrated beneath language. You have to finish what started. The room needs closure. He shook his head. I can't. I don't understand what will happen if I do. Her eyes softened. You'll remember. Remember what? She stepped forward closer now, her bare feet silent on the floor. Why you came. Why you stayed. Why you were always meant to return. Mason's hands were trembling. He stared at the bed, then down at the wet outline. I don't know if I can, he whispered. What if I don't wake up? Lauren tilted her head gently. That's not the question you should ask. Ask instead, what happens if you never leave? The shadows in the room lengthened. The mirror cracked further, a jagged web of fractures now spidering out from the center. In the reflection, Mason didn't see himself anymore. He saw the outline already full, already breathing, and then something moved in the mirror. Something stepped into the edge of the frame, the shadowed figure, the one from the hallway, the mirror, the bed. Only this time, it had his face, twisted slightly, distorted just enough to feel wrong. The eyes were wider, the mouth too thin, too still. It smiled slowly and raised one finger to its lips in a shushing gesture. Behind Mason, the floor rippled. A sound escaped the outline. Not a voice, not a growl. A heartbeat, one heavy beat, then another, then silence. Lauren stepped to the side. It has to be you. No one else can lie there. Mason stared at the outline. It waited patiently, its boundaries now firm and pulsing gently with warmth. He stepped forward, heart pounding so hard he thought it might drown out the silence. He crouched beside the shape. It was the same size as him, the same dimensions, made for him. He looked once more at Lauren. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with light, like she was made of something that only resembled human form now. He laid himself down inside the outline. The moment his back touched the floor, the liquid embraced him. Not wet, but binding. Not cold, but complete. The ceiling began to fade. The room pulled upward away from him. His eyes fluttered, and the last thing he saw before they closed was Lauren's face leaning over his, her mouth close to his ear. Her whisper was soft. Now you remember. And everything went black. Darkness wasn't the absence of sight. It was a presence here, heavy, textured, and full of memory. Not Mason's memories, not entirely. They swirled around him like layers of smoke, some sharp and familiar his first night at Pineview. The smell of cheap cleaning fluid and old curtains, and others utterly foreign. A man screaming through a locked bathroom door. A woman sobbing beneath the covers of room 238. A child hiding in the closet, whispering someone else's name. The blackness pressed in from all sides, a tunnel without walls, and Mason lay suspended in it, not floating, not grounded. The outline had swallowed him whole. And then sound, muffled at first. A low rhythmic thump. Not his heartbeat. A second one. Then it doubled. 2 beats. Then 4. A pounding, rising like boots against hallway tile. A stampede in slow motion. It wasn't outside him. It was inside the walls of whatever space he now occupied. Like something was walking across time toward him. Mason tried to open his eyes, but they wouldn't respond. It was like his body was elsewhere, and all that remained here was awareness. He wanted to move, to sit up, but there was no bed beneath him now, no floor. He was laying within memory itself, wrapped in the shape of a story he didn't write. A new sound began, whispering, but not words. The syllables were inverted, spoken in reverse, scraping the edges of his thoughts like dull knives. He strained to understand, but it slipped past comprehension. What remained was the meaning beneath the language hunger. Not for food, for presence, for acknowledgement. He was being watched, not by one thing, by many. Eyes that were not eyes. A collective gaze, ancient and intimate, like being stared at by your own guilt. The blackness shifted, not with light, but with suggestion. Slowly, a shape began to form around him. A room again, but wrong. Too long. Too narrow. Angled walls, slanting inward doorways, stretching to ceilings, impossible architecture that pulsed with a low-frequency hum. A mirror stood at the far end, towering, black, waiting. The whispering ceased. A stillness fell over the space. Then, from the base of the mirror, a shape began to crawl out. Not climb, not emerge. Crawl. Like smoke becoming bone, then skin, then clothing stitched from wet shadow. It was him, a second Mason, but changed, thinner, lips bruised, eyes hollow and gray. He stood slowly cracking joints with unnatural angles and stared at the original Mason, who was now standing somehow no longer trapped in the floor, but upright, though he had no memory of rising. They faced one another, and the reflection spoke, not aloud, in his mind. "You left. I stayed." Mason stepped backward, breath hitching. "You forgot." "I remembered." The mirror Mason smiled. His teeth were wrong, too many, too straight, too clean. "You came to forget her, and you did." "But I didn't." Mason tried to reply, but his voice failed him. The other stepped forward. One foot, then another, each step silent, but echoing like every movement rippled backward into the past. "I saw her after you left. I stayed. I held her hand when she asked for you. I watched the bed swallow her. I screamed and you didn't hear." The room vibrated. The walls wept faintly, moisture bleeding from the seams of the wallpaper. The floor between them opened slightly, not as a hole, but as a wound. Beneath it, a pulsing mass of memories, shadows of moments Mason had buried, ignored, dismissed as dreams or nonsense. Lauren crying into her hands on the motel balcony. A man dragging a suitcase with something twitching inside. The room key being dropped again and again by an unseen hand. Mason fell to his knees. It was too much. The weight of what he hadn't known hadn't allowed himself to know. The room didn't invent these things. It remembered them. And now it was making him remember too. The other Mason crouched beside him. "There's no door unless you make it. But it comes at a cost." "What cost?" Mason finally found the breath to ask. The other leaned close. "You." Then his hand reached forward and pressed against Mason's chest. Pain exploded through him. Not sharp, but spreading. A deep ache, like every lie he'd ever told himself, was being torn from his ribs. Images surged. Lauren sitting alone in the diner where they first met, unanswered voicemails. Dreams he'd forgotten where her face dissolved into static. The Shadow Mason stood and turned. A door had formed in the mirror, cracked and bleeding light. He walked toward it. Mason tried to rise, but his legs wouldn't obey. The floor began to sink beneath him, and the mirror Mason, his other self, paused at the threshold, looking back. "You stay this time," he whispered. "You keep it quiet." Then he stepped through the light, and the door vanished, leaving Mason alone in room 238 once again, but now under the bed, and the mattress above him creaked as a new weight settled in. The silence beneath the bed was unlike any Mason had ever experienced. It wasn't simply quiet. It was oppressive, a thick vacuum of sound that pressed against his eardrums and made him aware of every breath, every pulse in his neck, every micro-movement of his skin against the floor. The space under the bed was impossibly small, yet it felt vast, like the void between worlds. Above him, the mattress sagged slightly with weight. Someone was lying there. He knew that much. He could hear the minute shifting of limbs, the gentle rustle of sheets. Each sound sent a tremor through the wooden slats inches from his nose. He tried to move, but the air clung to him like syrup. His arms wouldn't lift. His legs remained locked. His outline still held his form, as though the room had memorized his shape too well to let it go. It wasn't holding him physically, not in the traditional sense. This was memory made tactile. The weight of what had been pressing down on what was. Above him, the breathing began. Not slow and rhythmic like sleep, but controlled, deliberate. The kind of breathing someone does when they're pretending to be asleep, when they're listening, watching, waiting. He strained to peer into the darkness beyond the bed frame. There was just enough light to see the thin gap between the floor and the baseboard. Dust moved gently in the stale air, stirred by no visible source. But there was something else, another eye, his, not the one he was using now, but the one that belonged to the version of himself that had walked through the mirror, the mason that had taken his place. He watched as that version of himself sat up slowly on the bed, bare feet touching the floor with uncanny precision. The toes flexed, the knees bent, and then the figure leaned down, peering over the edge of the bed and staring directly into the space where Mason lay. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the new Mason whispered, his voice soaked in something cold and ancient. "Are you still there?" Mason tried to respond, but his mouth didn't open. He screamed inwardly, his mind pressing against the edges of the silence like a trapped moth against glass. The other Mason smiled, and then something unexpected. He reached beneath the bed. Slowly, calmly. Fingers extended toward the darkness, and he touched him, not metaphorically, not psychologically, flesh to flesh. The moment their fingers met, everything reversed. The room spun, the ceiling dropped, the floor became the sky, and Mason was yanked forward, not pulled physically, but as if his consciousness was reeled like a fishing line through an impossible corridor of moments. He passed through glimpses of his own life, twisted through a lens he hadn't seen before, his childhood bedroom, warped by the scent of mildew, his father shouting in a motel parking lot, Lauren sobbing silently in a hospital corridor. Places and times that hadn't mattered until now. Then just as suddenly as it began, the spinning stopped, and he stood, fully upright, in the same room, room 238, but the bed was made now. The mirror no longer cracked, the outline gone. He looked down at himself. He was wearing his old clothes, his hoodie jeans, sneakers. He flexed his hands. Everything felt real, grounded. The light in the room was soft. Sunset through the blinds. The hum of electricity buzzed gently from the overhead light. Had it ended? Had the dream, the loop, the memory, the torment passed? He stepped toward the mirror and stared into it. His reflection stared back. Normal. Except behind his reflection, the door to the bathroom creaked open. A figure stepped out. Not Mason, not Lauren, not the shape from the outline, but a new face. A young man in a hotel uniform. Dark circles under his eyes. Pale, clammy skin. Holding a clipboard. His name tag read, Jonas. Jonas looked up, made eye contact through the mirror, and frowned. "You shouldn't be in here," he said. Mason turned startled, but when he looked behind him, the room was empty. He faced the mirror again. Jonas was still there, but now standing closer to the glass. "You're not checked in anymore," Jonas whispered. "They don't like squatters." Mason reached toward the mirror, and Jonas reached too. Their hands met, and the glass didn't stop him. The surface of the mirror rippled like disturbed water, cool and resistant, as Mason's fingertips pressed into it. The touch was brief, but in that instant sensation flooded back, cold fingers wrapped around his wrist from the other side, pulling not with force, but suggestion. It was an invitation, or a warning. Jonas's expression in the mirror remained strangely neutral, but his eyes flickered with something deeper, a fatigue older than time, a knowing weariness that only those trapped in cycles understand. Mason snatched his hand back, staggering away from the mirror. The room behind him remained still, but the atmosphere had shifted. The colors were the same, the faded beige wallpaper, the dusty green carpet, the old rotary phone on the nightstand. But everything was too sharp now, too vivid. The edges of the furniture cast shadows that bent in the wrong direction. The clock on the wall ticked, but its hands didn't move. He approached the window and peeled back the curtain. Outside, the parking lot was bathed in twilight. Cars sat exactly as he remembered, unmoving. The Pineview's neon sign buzzed in its loop. Vacancy, 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 with the N flickering faintly in and out. A man stood near the vending machine, unmoving, his head bowed. Mason watched him for a full minute. He never shifted, never breathed. Behind him, the bed creaked. Again, he turned slowly. The bedsheets had changed. They were no longer wrinkled and sunken from where he had lain earlier. They were pristine, tucked corners, smooth pillowcases, folded blanket at the foot. On the nightstand sat a folded piece of paper. He hadn't seen that before. Moving cautiously, Mason stepped forward and picked it up. The paper was old, the edges yellowed, but the handwriting inside was sharp and recent. It read, "If you see him again, do not answer." There was no signature, no context. But the implication was immediate. Jonas, the man in the mirror. He looked back toward it. It was empty now, just his reflection staring back. But something behind his image had changed. The walls in the reflection bore stains, thick, creeping stains like water damage, but darker, heavier, pulsing subtly with color. Black, red, the same stains that had once marred the floor. In the real room, the walls were clean, pristine. But in the mirror, they remembered. He backed away again, and as he did, he noticed something new on the carpet, a thin trail. Not wet, not fresh. A path made by dragging something or someone. It led from under the bed to the bathroom door. Faint scuff marks, a slight depression in the fibers. He followed it, heart clenching with each step. The bathroom door stood ajar, as it had in the mirror. The light inside flickered. He pushed it open. Inside, the mirror over the sink had been shattered. Shards littered the counter and floor, some of them still wet with condensation, or was it blood? The sink was dry, the faucet rusty and crusted with age. But in the tub, he saw hair, a tangled mass of dark, wet strands draped over the edge of the porcelain, unmoving. He froze, stepped closer. Lauren. At least it looked like Lauren. Her body lay curled, knees pulled to chest, arms wrapped around her legs like she'd been trying to disappear. Her skin was pale, bloated, eyes open but unseeing. Mason felt something crack inside him like a thread breaking under too much tension. This couldn't be real. He reached for her, but before his fingers touched her skin, her eyes blinked. Not slowly, not dreamily, but sharp, deliberate. She turned her head toward him and whispered one word. "Run!" Her hand snapped up, grabbing his wrist with a strength that didn't match her limp form. He gasped, stumbled back, but her grip was unyielding. Her mouth opened wider, unnaturally wide, and from inside her throat came a low groan that sounded nothing like her voice. The light above them shattered, and behind Mason, from the doorway, another voice spoke. "I told you not to answer." It was Jonas, but his voice had changed. It was deeper now, layered with echoes like wind blowing through a tunnel of teeth. Mason ripped free of Lauren's grasp and bolted shoulder slamming into the bathroom doorframe. He scrambled back into the main room, breath-wild limbs cold with adrenaline. But the room had changed again. The The ceiling was lower, the door was gone, the windows bricked over, and standing in front of the mirror now was Jonas, not as the tired hotel clerk, but as something else entirely. His body flickered between forms, one moment in the faded uniform, the next in a blackened suit, the next a thing with no face at all, only a stretched grin carved across where skin should have been. He pointed a long gray finger toward Mason. Under the bed, where you belong. The mattress lifted off the frame on its own, hovering like something exhaling from below. Mason turned, but the floor was already gone beneath him, and he fell. Back into the dark, Mason landed hard, but there was no impact. Just the sensation of falling, and then suddenly, not falling, his body weightless one moment, then fixed in place like a pin pressed into velvet. The darkness around him was thicker now, tactile, clinging to his skin with every slow breath he managed to take. He couldn't see not even his own hands, but he could feel the space. It wasn't empty. It was inhabited, not by bodies, but by impressions. Residual energy, memories leaking through the seams of forgotten rooms. He lay there for a long moment, his senses adjusting, trying to define boundaries that no longer played by normal rules. The ground, or whatever passed for it, felt neither solid nor soft. It gave just enough to imply presence, but not comfort. A weight gathered on his chest, not physical, not spiritual. A pressure of awareness, like he was being studied from every angle by something older than time and far more patient. And then a voice, not a whisper this time. It was his. You thought running made you free. Mason sat upright, or rather the space shifted around him, and he was simply upright. His own voice echoed again from somewhere deeper. You walked out that night, left the motel behind, pretended she never called, ignored every sign, buried it like everything else. A soft glow appeared ahead, an outline in dim blue light forming a doorway. It wasn't open, but transparent, like looking through heavy rain. Behind it, he could see a memory, Lauren's apartment, her coat on the chair, the lamp still on, that voicemail blinking red on her answering machine, the one he never played, never returned. The scene froze, suspended in unnatural stillness. She asked you to come. His voice continued. And you said you'd think about it, but you didn't. You packed. You got in the car. You kept driving west. And when she disappeared, you told yourself she was tired, that she just needed space. The door shimmered and faded, replaced by a new scene. Mason, days later, tossing Lauren's last photo into a box. His expression blank. The box taped, labeled past, and shoved under a bed in a different motel in another town entirely. You buried her before the world did, the voice said, and you thought that made it easier. But the room didn't forget. The light went out, and Mason was alone again. No one leaves the room until they remember the voice finished. And you're not even halfway through. Suddenly the darkness peeled back, not completely, but enough for form and shape to emerge. He was no longer floating in nothing. He stood in a corridor now endless in both directions. Doors lined the walls. All of them bore numbers. Room 238. Again and again. Each one slightly different. One door was made of warped wood, another painted green, another metal and rusting. Dozens, maybe hundreds of room 238s stretched on infinitely. He turned to the nearest one and reached out. The doorknob was slick. It turned too easily. Inside the first night, the moment he'd checked in, the humming vending machine. The receptionist looking up without blinking. The woman in the hallway with the bruised arm and hollow smile. But there was no Mason inside. Only the shape of him, like a silhouette burned into reality. He closed the door. The next room, another version. This time Lauren was with him, laughing, sitting on the bed, drinking cheap wine from plastic cups, their clothes piled near the heater. This hadn't happened, not in his memory. But it had happened in a possibility. He closed the door before it could change. The third door, he stood over the bed watching her sleep. The lights flickered. The mirror behind him cracked slowly. A hand reached from under the mattress, not for her, but for him. He opened his mouth to scream, and the version of him in the room did the same. And then the hand reached through the glass instead. He slammed the door shut. The corridor dimmed. He looked back the way he came, only to find there was no door behind him anymore, just more hallway. Mason turned back to the line of doors. One stood ajar, unlike the others. Something about it called to him. The number was the same, but scratched below it were 4 letters etched in jagged lines, like nails had carved them. Stay. He pushed it open. Inside was the pine view, but not the one he remembered. It was the blueprint, the foundation, the original before the remodels, before the name, before the town swallowed it whole. The walls were exposed. The wood still smelled of new rot and ancient mold. There were no beds yet, no mirrors, but on the floor something was being drawn, with chalk, with blood. Mason stepped inside. A man knelt in the center of the room, head bowed, whispering as he sketched runes that glowed faintly beneath his fingers. His hands trembled. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. He looked up, sensing Mason's presence, but not with alarm, with relief. You're late, the man rasped. Mason frowned. Who are you? The man pointed to the unfinished walls around them. This place eats grief. It thrives on things we don't finish. You brought it more than most. You made it strong. Mason stepped back, breath caught in his chest. What do you mean I made it strong? The man stood now, his face pale and creased. Familiar, not because Mason had seen it before, but because it was a future version of himself. Older, frayed, defeated. You came back too many times, he said. And now you're a fixture. The room pulsed. The markings on the floor glowed brighter, and behind the man, another outline began to form. The outline on the floor took shape with methodical precision, forming itself as though guided by an unseen hand. At first, it was nothing more than a trace, a faint red stain bleeding into the raw wood, curling into familiar curves and lines. But Mason recognized the form before it was halfway complete. The shoulders, the narrow waist, the angle of the hands, palms down, fingers just slightly splayed. It was Lauren, not just a woman, not just a memory. The room remembered her better than he did. It didn't need photos or names. It needed impressions, pain, presence, and the outline it shaped now glowed faintly as if alive. Mason stared numb, while the older version of himself, the man who had spoken, stepped around the form, with something between reverence and resignation. The older Mason's face was lined with time and guilt, hollowed out by years that the younger Mason hadn't yet lived. His eyes, however, were not empty. They carried the weight of knowledge, dangerous, volatile knowledge that clung to the walls like mildew. She didn't die here, the old man said, voice dry. But her memory did. You made sure of that. Mason flinched. I didn't kill her. No, the old man said, crouching beside the outline. But you didn't follow her either. You let her disappear. You let the room take her story because it was easier than keeping it alive. And in this place, stories are currency. Mason opened his mouth to argue, to protest. But there was no strength behind the words forming in his throat. Somewhere deep down beneath the fear, beneath the denial, he understood. The Pine View wasn't haunted by ghosts in the traditional sense. It was haunted by unfinished truths, memories, never resolved apologies, never spoken aloud. This room didn't invent horror. It curated it. It housed the weight of things left unsaid. The older Mason began drawing something beside the outline symbols, sigils, marks etched in a language that Mason did not recognize but instinctively understood. Each one made the room heavier, like the very air protested their creation. As the chalk scraped the wood, Mason felt a rising pressure in his temples. a soft hum that vibrated behind his eyes. "What are you doing?" he asked. The old man didn't look up. "I've tried everything else. I've begged, I've screamed, I've stayed silent. The only thing I haven't done is finish the ritual." Mason stepped closer, unease crawling up his spine. "What ritual?" "The one that locks it, that finally closes the door between memory and reality." "You mean destroy the room?" "Not destroy," the older Mason said. "Contain. Memory doesn't disappear. It just needs walls." As the last of the symbols was drawn, the floor pulsed beneath them. The outline of Lauren shimmered again, no longer still. A soft, undulating wave passed through the wood, almost like breath. Mason saw her chest rise slightly. Her fingers twitch. "She's not here," Mason whispered, eyes wide. "She's here in the way a song is still in the air after the music stops," the old man said. "She's here because you left too much of her behind." Mason crouched beside the outline now. "What happens if you finish this?" The man hesitated. "Someone has to stay. Someone always has to stay." Mason stared at him. "You mean you're leaving?" The old Mason nodded slowly. "That was always the hope. You've taken my place now. I've done what I could. I held it back for as long as I was able, but this room doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. It recycles. And now that you've remembered, it's your turn to carry the weight." "No," Mason said. "No, I didn't agree to that. You did the moment you stepped inside again." The outline shifted and Lauren's face formed in the woods softly like a memory manifesting through amber. Her lips moved. No sound, just shape. "Stay with me." Mason stood stumbling backward. The old man stood too, nodding at the mirror mounted on the wall behind them, the only pristine thing in the room. "You won out," he said. "Then you have to do what I couldn't. You have to finish it without looking away." The mirror shimmered. Its surface didn't show their reflection. It showed the other rooms. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Every version of room 238. Different states of ruin. Different horrors. Different people sleeping in the beds, some awake, some crying, some being pulled under. Mason's hands trembled. "I don't know how," he whispered. "Yes, you do," the old man said. "You've always known. You just didn't want to." The lights dimmed again. The symbols on the floor began to flicker. Something had sensed the ritual, something that didn't want it completed. The walls groaned. The mirror cracked. The door behind them vanished. From somewhere beneath the floor, a sound rose, a deep, rhythmic thumping like a heart pumping against the floorboards, insistent and angry. "You have to finish it now," the old man said, urgency in his voice. "Say her name. Trace the outline. Speak the truth." "What truth?" Mason cried. "That you didn't forget her because it hurt too much," the old man said. "You forgot her because it was easier than forgiving yourself." The floor split. A hand rose from the outline, not pale, not spectral, human, alive, and reaching for him. The hand that emerged from the outline was warm. That detail struck Mason immediately, not cold, not ghostly, not spectral like he expected, but warm with the unmistakable pulse of life. It trembled slightly, fingers splayed, unsure of its strength, but real and human. His heart slammed against his ribs, not from fear this time, but from something deeper. Recognition, not just of the hand, but of what it meant. He crouched beside it, unsure if he should touch it. The fingers curled slightly, then opened again, waiting. The old man, his future self, stood off to the side, silent, now watching. He had stepped back from the ritual circle, hands clasped in front of him, like someone observing a burial or a birth. Mason reached out slowly. His palm hovered just above the hand. "Lauren," he whispered. The name barely escaped his lips. Saying it aloud felt like splitting skin, raw and dangerous. The fingers jerked slightly at the sound. He took a breath and let his hand descend. The moment their skin connected, a rush of images flooded him, too many too fast. Lauren standing alone in a motel parking lot, barefoot, eyes rimmed red. Her voice leaving message after message unheard. Her hands pressed against a window while something pulled her backward into a room that no longer obeyed time. All of it overlaid with his own voice, whispering apologies he never said. I'm sorry he breathed not out of obligation, but because it had lived inside him for years, unspoken and sour. The outline glowed brighter. The floor beneath them groaned like strained timber. The walls pulsed, rippling with cracks, as if the room itself were resisting what was coming next. The hand tightened around his. Then, slowly, deliberately, the rest of her began to rise from the floor. It wasn't a ghost rising. It was Lauren. Her eyes blinked open, adjusting to light that didn't come from any bulb. Her skin was pale but not drained. Her body carried no rot, no marks of violence, only the weight of time. She looked up at him, eyes wide, tears glinting at the edges like dew on old glass. You stayed, she said, her voice soft, fragile, real. He helped her up, steadying her as she stood. Her movements were slow, unsteady, but each motion seemed to restore a little more of her. Her shape, her color, her breath. I didn't know, he said. I didn't know what this place had done. She nodded. You weren't supposed to. That's what made it work. Mason glanced around the room. The air had shifted again. Not lighter, but clearer. The pressure that had choked the space since he arrived had thinned, replaced by something else. Something even more terrifying consequence. The older Mason stepped forward again, his face drawn tighter, now paler. He looked at Lauren, and then back at his younger self. You're close, he said, but you haven't finished. Lauren reached down, pulling the last piece of chalk from the floor, the one the old man had used to draw the sigils. She handed it to Mason. He looked at it. What do I do? You speak her name again, the old man said. This time as truth, not as memory. And you complete the circle. Mason hesitated, heart racing, and then he stepped to the floor, kneeling beside the glowing outline that had now receded to a quiet shimmer. He pressed the chalk to the floor and completed the symbol, the one the old Mason had never been able to finish. The lines closed, and the circle lit with a golden hue more stable than the red from before. He stood and faced Lauren. Lauren Avery Hart, he said, his voice shaking. I remember you. As the words left his mouth, the room convulsed. A violent quake rippled outward, not destructive, but cathartic, like something held in place for too long had finally been released. The mirror shattered, spraying light instead of glass. The walls split and healed at once. The symbols on the floor dissolved into dust the ritual no longer needed. Then the door appeared, simple, wooden, closed but real. The old man nodded. You've done what I couldn't. You ended the loop. But what happens to you now? Mason asked. The old man smiled, a faint, almost invisible smile. I was only ever here because you refused to face it. Now that you have, I fade. And just like that, he vanished. Not with drama, not with spectacle. He simply blinked out, as if the space he occupied had never existed. Mason turned to Lauren. She looked at the door, then at him. Are you ready to leave? She asked. He didn't speak. He took her hand. They walked toward the door together. But before they reached it, something caught Mason's eye on the nightstand. The original one. The drawer was slightly open, a sliver of darkness inside. He paused. Lauren squeezed his hand. It's not important, but it was. He stepped toward it and opened the drawer. Inside, a hotel guest book, one he hadn't seen before. The pages were blank, except the last one, a signature, Mason Graves, and below it, checked in, never checked out. He stared. Lauren placed her hand on his shoulder. It's not your name anymore, she whispered. Let it go. He tore the page from the book, folded it, and placed it in his pocket. Then he opened the door and stepped into the light. The light beyond the door wasn't blinding. It was soft, like morning mist filtered through gauze curtains. It didn't burn or sting, but it illuminated everything. Mason blinked against its clarity. His hand tightened instinctively around Lauren's as they stepped across the threshold. For a brief second, he expected resistance. He expected the world to shift again, to drag them backward into one more version of room 238. But the floor beneath his feet held, solid, concrete, cold in a familiar way. They stood in the hallway of the Pineview Motel. But it wasn't like before. The lights were on, flickering slightly, casting long shadows that no longer whispered or moved on their own. The wallpaper was faded, but not peeling. The carpet held the scent of stale air freshener instead of mold. There were no eyes behind the peepholes, no breathing behind the walls, just silence. Mason looked back. The door to room 238 had closed behind them. No sound, no click. It was simply shut. He stepped forward and tried the handle. Locked. He exhaled and turned toward Lauren. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. There was relief in her gaze, but something else too, like she was still waiting for the room to take them back, as if she couldn't quite believe they were really out. "We're not done," she said quietly. Mason nodded. "I know." They moved down the hallway together, passing the old ice machine and a vending unit that still glowed, faintly humming with the same eerie tune Mason remembered from his first night. But it didn't seem sinister now, just old. Like the building itself was exhaling after holding its breath for years. The motel lobby was empty. No receptionist at the desk, no ringing bell. Just an old ceiling fan creaking overhead and a dusty clock that read 3:14 a.m. Lauren walked over to the front desk. A sign sat crookedly in a plastic holder manager on break. "Please ring bell." She didn't ring it. Mason stepped behind the counter and opened the guest log. Page after page of names and dates, some scrawled hastily, some crossed out. One entry had no name, only a room number 238 repeated again and again in the same handwriting, like someone had been trying to remember where they'd been. Lauren leaned over the counter and pointed. "That's mine," she said. The entry under her name had been crossed out, but faintly like whoever had done it hadn't pressed hard enough to make it stick. Mason picked up the pen lying nearby and uncrossed the line, scribbling gently until her name was legible again. Lauren smiled softly, but her expression didn't last. She turned toward the glass doors that led outside. The parking lot was bathed in amber light, but there were no cars, no wind. The world looked paused, as though time waited for them to decide what came next. "I don't think we're in the real world yet," she said. Mason approached the door and pressed his hand to the glass. It didn't feel like glass. It felt like memory, soft, warm, too pliable to be real. He pulled back. "We're still in it, just deeper." Lauren nodded. "We passed the threshold, but we're not out. We've just moved further in." The thought chilled him. The Pineview didn't trap people by locking doors or stealing keys. It trapped them by nesting reality, by wrapping layers of perception like wallpaper over rot. You could leave room 238 and never leave the building. You could drive away and still find yourself circling the same hallway in your dreams. He turned toward the key rack behind the desk. Every key hung neatly except one. It wasn't missing. It was different, wrapped in red thread, the number burned into the plastic, not stamped. When he reached out to touch it, the metal fob was warm, and the string pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. "I think we need to give it back," he said. Lauren looked at him. "To who? I don't know. But someone or something has been holding this place together, keeping it alive." He slipped the key into his pocket. They exited the lobby. Outside, the sky was a deep indigo. Stars hung too still, too sharp. Not a single breeze stirred the air. But they could move now. The parking lot wasn't endless. A road stretched from the edge, vanishing into the desert. And for the first time since he arrived, Mason felt something almost like choice. They started walking, not toward any specific destination, just forward. Each step made the asphalt feel more solid. Each breath made the air more breathable. And then Lauren spoke again, her voice steadier now. "There's one more place we need to go." Mason turned his head. "Where?" She didn't look at him, just kept walking, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Where I died," she said. "Or where I was meant to." Mason's skin prickled. He slowed, but she kept going. "You remember it," she continued. "You just never looked too closely." He did remember. The motel on the edge of Henderson. The night she called him. The one he let go to voicemail. He hadn't meant to ignore it. He just didn't want to hear what she had to say. That she was afraid. That she felt watched. That she wanted him nearby. He hadn't wanted the burden of her unraveling. So he had told himself she was dramatic. That she was tired. That she'd be fine by morning. And then she was gone. Until the letter started. Until room 238 reopened. Until everything began to pull him back. Mason closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the desert road had changed. There was a motel ahead, not the Pine View. Older, smaller, long abandoned. Its neon sign was rusted, shattered. But the number on the front door was clear. Again. Always. Lauren stopped at the base of the steps. She looked back at him. Her expression was different now. No fear, only resolve. "Are you ready to finish it?" she asked. He nodded, and together they entered the place where everything ended and began. The screen door groaned as Mason pulled it open, the hinges giving way with a dry, metallic whine that seemed louder than it should have in the still desert air. Beyond the threshold, the interior of the motel was shrouded in shadow, but not darkness. There was a subtle glow inside, faint and golden, as if the room generated its own dying light. Not electric, but organic, like the soft pulse behind closed eyes. The air smelled of dust and something older. Not rot, but disuse. As if time here had stopped not recently but long ago, and had settled in the corners like a guest who never planned to leave. The wallpaper had peeled back in large sheets, exposing stained drywall beneath. The ceiling fan above them spun lazily, though no power seemed to be connected. Mason's eyes adjusted slowly, taking in the full breadth of the space. Room 238 again, but stripped. No beds, no furniture, just remnants. Marks on the floor where furniture used to stand. Faint outlines on the wall where a headboard once pressed. The ghost of a mirror, its edges still outlined by dust and grime. The room wasn't empty. It was echoing, haunted not by spirits but by form. Lauren stepped forward first. Her feet made no sound on the warped floorboards. She crossed the room with the quiet certainty of someone returning to a place they'd never truly left. Mason watched her as she reached the far wall where a single window had been nailed shut with crooked planks. Her fingers hovered over the boards, not touching, just remembering. "This is where it started," she said softly. "The real end. The night I called you." Mason stood in the doorway, suddenly unsure if he belonged here. This was her story, not his. Or maybe it was theirs. Jointly written in the silence between words, never spoken. "You were afraid," he said. Lauren nodded. "I had every reason to be. What happened here?" She turned to face him, her expression calm. "Someone knocked. That's all. Just a knock. Over and over again. But no one was ever at the door. And when I finally opened it, the hallway was gone. The whole motel had vanished. Only this room remained." Mason stepped inside, finally crossing the invisible line between observer and participant. He walked to where a dresser might have once stood, saw the faint grooves left in the floor from decades of weight. He looked toward the far corner near the boarded window and saw a stain on the wood. Small, dark, circular, blood. "Did something follow you?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not follow, find." He looked at her eyes, searching. "But why you?" She turned back toward the window. "Because I remembered. Because I knew this place once long before I stepped into it. My parents stayed here when I was little. This room. I heard them fighting in the bathroom, whispering things they thought I couldn't hear. I saw something in the mirror one night. Something that smiled back when I wasn't smiling. I forgot all of it until I returned." She touched the boards now gently. Memories rot in places like this. They become part of the walls. Mason felt the temperature drop. The air thickened. The room dimmed slightly, the golden hue giving way to amber, then gray. The space itself responded to her words, to the unveiling of truth, not malevolently, but with hunger. The kind that comes from being starved of meaning for too long. "What do we do?" he asked. Lauren stepped to the center of the room. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a photograph, creased, water-damaged. Mason moved closer. It was of her as a child, no more than 6 or 7, sitting on the edge of a motel bed. This room. The same faded wallpaper behind her. Her eyes wide. In her lap, a teddy bear with one missing eye. "I found this," she said, folded in the pages of a phone book in the Pineview lobby. I didn't remember it at first, but when I looked closer, I felt the room again. I remembered the sound the bed made when I shifted my weight, the way the air vent rattled, how the closet door never quite stayed shut. She handed it to Mason. "It's a key," she said. "Not to a door, to the story, to why the room took me." Mason studied the image. It wasn't just a photo. It was a map. The shadows, the lines of the wallpaper, even the bear's missing eye, they all pointed to something. Layers he hadn't seen before. He looked up. "So what do we do with it?" "We burn it," she said. Mason stiffened. "What?" Lauren's voice remained calm. "This isn't about destroying the place. It's about releasing the version of me that never left. The one trapped in the photo. The one the room kept feeding off. If we burn it, we end its hold." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. She pulled a box of matches from her other pocket, old labeled from a long-defunct diner. She struck one. The sulfur hissed, a brief flare of orange in the gloom. Mason held the photo out, and Lauren touched the flame to its corner. It caught slowly at first, the edges curling inward, the ink blistering. But as the fire spread, the room began to shake, not violently, but rhythmically, like breath, like a great exhale. The boards under their feet pulsed. The mirror outline on the wall cracked. The boarded window rattled. The photo crumbled into ash in Mason's palm, and then silence. No glow, no pressure, just stillness. Lauren stood motionless, as if waiting for something to change. And then she looked at Mason. "It's fading," she whispered. "I can feel it, like the thread's been cut." He reached for her hand again, but this time she didn't take it. She smiled instead. "You got me out," she said. "That was the deal." His mouth opened, but no sound came. She reached up and touched his face once, gently, and then stepped backward. The room began to fade around her. Not collapse, not disappear, just dim, like a memory being put to rest. She was the last to fade. Her smile remained a moment longer, and then Mason was alone, in an empty room. No number on the door, no trace of her outline on the floor, no sound but his own breathing. Mason stood alone in the silence, the weight of the extinguished memory settling on his shoulders, like a coat he couldn't take off. The room around him no longer pulsed or shimmered. It simply existed, bare and neutral, stripped of its former hunger. The air had a stillness that was almost sacred, as if some long tormented spirit had been laid to rest, and now the structure itself was exhaling its last breath. He slowly turned, surveying the space. The photograph was gone. No ashes, no scent of smoke. Even the faint stain on the floor where it had burned had vanished, as if it had never happened. The boards no longer creaked. The ceiling fan had stopped spinning. Everything was still, dead still, but peaceful. And that more than anything unsettled him. He reached for the doorknob. This time it was cool to the touch, ordinary, almost forgettable. He turned it, expecting resistance, but the door swung open smoothly. Outside, the motel lot stretched beneath a lavender sky painted with streaks of early dawn. The stars had dimmed. A breeze stirred faintly across the gravel, warm and dry, carrying with it the distant scent of creosote and desert dust. He stepped out onto the porch and let the door close gently behind him. The faded 238 above the door no longer meant anything. It was just a number now. Not a lock, not a sentence. Just chipped brass nailed to a piece of cracked wood. The road was waiting, but there was something else first. Mason walked slowly around the side of the building. The desert opened beyond the lot, like a quiet ocean of rust-red soil and dry brush. But near the back of the property, half buried beneath the shifting dirt, he saw something that stopped him cold. A mailbox, old, rusted, its flag bent at a sharp angle. Paint flaked off the side, but a name remained faded but legible. Avery. He crouched, heart thudding once. He opened the mailbox. Inside, only one item remained, an envelope sealed crisp in contrast to the decay around it. It bore no address, no stamp, only one word written in the center in block letters. Mason. He took it out with slow fingers, the paper cold, despite the warming morning air. It felt heavy, as if it carried not just words, but a final task. He tore the flap gently and pulled out the single page within. Lauren's handwriting. You remember me now. That's all I ever needed. It wasn't about blame. It was about being real again, even if only in your mind. The room couldn't consume me once you saw me clearly. You gave me back my shape, my voice, my truth. Now you have to do the same for yourself. Leave this place before it becomes you. Below the writing, in small cursive, she'd added, burn the key. He looked down into his pocket. The key to room 238 still sat there wrapped in red thread, pulsing softly like a heartbeat unwilling to stop. He took it out, unwrapped it. The plastic fob glinted in the rising light, no longer menacing but heavy with meaning. This was the tether, the last artifact of the place. As long as it existed, so did the room. In some form, somewhere, waiting. Mason looked around. Then he spotted the small metal trash can beside a long dead utility pole. He walked toward it, tore a page from his notebook, and set it inside the can. Then he placed the key on top, struck a match, and dropped it in. The paper caught first, curling and blackening. The thread shriveled, pulling inward. The plastic bubbled. The key let out one sharp crack as if screaming in protest, and then turned to a molten sliver in the ash. The flame consumed it quickly, hungrily. And then nothing. The pulse in his chest slowed. His breath deepened. The tension in his spine there since the moment he stepped into the pine view began to unwind. It was done. He turned back to the road. The sun was beginning to rise now, just a sliver above the eastern horizon, painting the asphalt in gold and crimson. He stepped toward it, not with haste, but with purpose. The motel behind him shrank with every step, not physically, but in his mind. Its hold was broken. A bird cried out in the distance. The wind shifted cool against his neck. He walked until the building was out of sight, and then he kept walking. Because sometimes escape isn't about running from a place. It's about choosing not to return. And Mason Graves would never return. Not to the Pine View. Not to room 238. Not even in dreams. Hours passed. Mason had no idea how far he'd walked. The road wound lazily through the desert, disappearing and reappearing behind low hills and bone-dry outcroppings. No cars passed. No signs of civilization interrupted the quiet. The world felt vast and empty, like a canvas between brushstrokes. And maybe that was fitting, because Mason wasn't anyone anymore. Not yet. Not fully. He was no longer haunted, but he hadn't yet become whole either. He was in the in-between where ghosts used to thrive. He kept walking. By midday, the heat climbed, pressing down on his shoulders like a wet cloth. Sweat clung to the back of his neck. His water bottle bought days ago, in a life that felt like fiction, was nearly empty. But he didn't mind. The rhythm of his footsteps, the sound of gravel crunching under his soles, soothed him more than sleep had in weeks. It was only when he saw the billboard that he realized how far from anything he truly was. It rose crookedly from the side of the road, partially collapsed, the metal frame twisted by time and weather. Most of the paint had faded, but he could still make out the words, Pineview, motel clean rooms, hot showers, free cable, exit 7. His legs froze. For a second, his mind buckled, heart thudding in panic. Had he come full circle? Was it starting over? He approached slowly, scanning the landscape around him. No exit, no sign of a turnoff, just the desert and this old rusted sign standing like a monument to something that should have crumbled. He stepped closer. A piece of the sign, bent back by wind, had revealed another layer beneath the paint. He reached up, carefully peeled it away. Underneath, in faded black ink older than the rest of the sign, he saw the original message. Red Hill Cemetery, 1884-1911. Last resting place of the Avery family. His breath caught. The Avery family, Lauren Avery. He stared at the dates. The cemetery hadn't been active in over a century. Had Lauren's name, her story, been tied to something older than even she realized? Was she born into something the room had already claimed? He took a step back, trying to make sense of it, but a part of him already knew. The room had never simply been a place. It had been a pattern, a wound in reality that reopened every time someone remembered it. Lauren hadn't been the first, and she wouldn't have been the last unless Mason was willing to close the loop entirely. He looked around. To the east, a cluster of weather-worn stones poked out of the ground, barely visible in the distance. Gravestones. He made his way toward them, heart racing with something that wasn't fear, but purpose. It took him 20 minutes to reach the site. The cemetery was nothing more than a forgotten patch of land surrounded by a crumbling stone wall. Most of the graves were unmarked. A few had headstones so eroded that the names were nearly illegible. But one stood apart from the rest, untouched by weather or time. The stone was black marble, polished and clean. Fresh even. Lauren A. Hart, 1985-2014. He froze. The date of her disappearance. Someone had buried her. But who and when? There were no flowers. No offerings. Just a single silver coin resting on the base of the headstone, glinting softly in the sun. He picked it up. One side bore the usual markings, a faded image of liberty worn from decades of circulation. The other side had been scratched, deliberately deep etchings, forming a shape he recognized all too well. The sigil from room 238. This wasn't a grave. It was an anchor, a tether, and it meant the room wasn't finished, despite the ritual, despite the burning. Despite Lauren's release, something was still keeping a piece of her tied to this place, to this land, to this loop. He pocketed the coin and stood slowly, glancing back toward the broken billboard. The layers made sense now. Lauren's family had roots here. Perhaps her bloodline carried the imprint of the room. Or maybe the room had simply attached itself to the trauma already buried deep in her ancestry. It didn't matter. What mattered was the coin, and the fact that someone had planted it here. He needed answers, and there was only one place left that might hold them. Mason turned toward the distant haze where the town of Red Hill once stood. It wasn't on any modern map, but he'd heard the name once long ago when passing through Nevada's back roads. A mining settlement turned ghost town, erased from memory during the Dust Bowl. But if there were any records left, any history, he had to find it. Because if someone had put that headstone there, if someone had carved that coin, then Mason wasn't the last thread connecting to room 238. Someone else was trying to open it again. And this time it wouldn't just take one girl, it would take everyone. The sun was beginning to dip when Mason reached the outskirts of what had once been Red Hill. It was hardly a town now, just a cluster of broken buildings slumped like forgotten bones along the edge of the desert basin. Dust clung to every surface, and the air was still, except for the occasional sharp rattle of a loose sheet of corrugated metal groaning in the breeze. Half buried by time and sand, the town had the look of a place that had died quickly, but never completely. Its silence was too intentional, too clean, like someone or something had pressed pause rather than letting it decay naturally. Mason passed a skeletal general store, its shelves still inside, slanted and warped. A rusted can of peaches lay split open near the door. Flies, long dead, were mummified in place on its jagged edge. Further down the street stood the remnants of a church. Its steeple cracked the bell, half submerged in the ground, as though the earth had grown tired of the sound and pulled it down. But it was the building at the far end of the dirt road that caught his eye. The town records office. It was the only structure that seemed untouched by the elements. Its roof was intact, its windows unbroken. A wooden sign hung above the door, reading simply, "Red Hill Archives." He approached with a wariness that had settled into him over the past few days like muscle memory. His fingers closed around the tarnished brass knob. The door opened with a slow creak, not of protest, but welcome. The interior was surprisingly intact. Dust blanketed everything in thick gray sheets, but the furniture remained upright, the papers undisturbed. It felt more like a preserved diorama than an abandoned office, like someone had intended this place to remain just so untouched as a time capsule waiting to be opened by the right hands. Rows of file cabinets lined the back wall. An old card catalog stood to one side, drawers pulled out and frozen mid-search. On the far wall hung a single portrait, an oil painting of a man in a dark suit with pale eyes and a pinched mouth. The brass plate beneath read, Mayor Everett T. Avery, 1908. Avery. Mason stared at the name for a long time. Lauren had never mentioned family in Red Hill, at least not to him. But the link was too clean, too direct to ignore. He walked past the painting and opened the closest filing cabinet, scanning rows of brittle folders. Most were records of land purchases, mining claims, birth and death registries. He moved through the drawers methodically until he found one labeled Incident Reports, 1909, 1911. Inside was a manila envelope thicker than the rest, stamped in red. Confidential, do not release. He pulled it out, blew the dust off the surface and opened it carefully. Inside were a series of typed pages and handwritten notes. The first report was dated September 14th, 1909, and referenced a rash of disappearances in the Red Hill area. Men and women both always last seen entering room 3 of the local boarding house on South Elm Street. Several pages later, a deputy's note. Room is structurally sound. No signs of struggle. Guests vanish with personal effects left behind. Locals whisper of something old waking under the town. Reports of dreams among residents growing common. Dreams of voices behind walls, of knocks with no source. The deeper he read, the more the language shifted from factual to frantic. Scrawlings replaced formality. One page had only 3 lines repeated over and over. It remembers, it remembers, it remembers. At the bottom of the envelope was a torn photograph. Mason pulled it out and unfolded it gently. It showed a group of 5 people standing in front of the boarding house. A man in uniform, 2 women, a young boy, and standing apart from them all, a woman in a white dress, her face indistinct blurred, as if motion had distorted the exposure. But everything else in the photograph was perfectly clear. The name scrawled on the back in pencil, L. Avery the witness, Lauren's ancestor, or maybe Lauren herself. The resemblance was impossible to miss. Mason sat heavily on the floor, the photo in one hand, the coin in the other. The picture he was assembling made his skin crawl not from fear, but from clarity. The room had never been confined to the Pine View. Room 238 was a pattern and idea. It infected spaces, repeated itself through time like a curse encoded into a name. And the Avery line, for reasons he didn't yet understand, had been the primary vessel. But then why him? Why Mason? He thought back to his own family, to his grandfather, who died under strange circumstances, to stories his mother told of dreams she couldn't explain. He remembered an old motel they'd stayed in once during a cross-country trip when he was 9. The air conditioner that didn't work, the red room key, the peeling wallpaper, room 238. He had been there too, a different version, a different state. But it was always the same room. His connection hadn't started with Lauren. It had started before memory, before reason. He wasn't just a witness, he was part of the pattern. And now that Lauren was gone, the room would reach again through the next weak place in the world, through the next person tied to its design. He stood slowly. If he could find the original building room 3 in the old boarding house, maybe he could do more than just delay the curse. Maybe he could dismantle the very source, the point where the story had first rooted itself into time. He folded the photograph, carefully placed it beside the coin in his pocket, and looked once more at Mayor Everett Avery's portrait. The face seemed to smile now. But maybe that was just the dust shifting. Mason turned toward the door and stepped back into the dying light. He had one more room to visit, and this time he would be the last guest it ever received. The sun was sinking behind the hills when Mason finally reached the south end of Red Hill. The sky had turned the color of bruised peach and ochre, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the cracked ground. The boarding house stood at the edge of town like a forgotten sentinel, its 3-story frame tilting ever so slightly to the west. The roof sagged near the center, and the paint had long since peeled away, revealing the gray bones of weather-worn timber beneath. But the structure was still intact, and somehow it felt alive. Mason paused at the rusted gate hands resting on the chipped wood, his eyes locked on the second-floor window directly above the front door. The curtains there fluttered, though the air was still. Something moved behind them, something not visible, but unmistakably present. He didn't flinch. The dread that once gnawed at his spine had become something else now. Something like grim acceptance. He had seen too much, felt too much. If this was the source, then he would go to it and end it. The porch steps groaned under his weight. Weeds pushed through the boards. A discarded tricycle lay on its side by the wall, its paint eaten away by decades of sun and sand. The front door was ajar, not locked, not even fully closed, just open enough to suggest he was expected. He pushed it gently and the hinges moaned, opening onto a foyer soaked in amber light. Dust motes danced in the slanted sunbeams, their slow descent almost theatrical. The smell hit him immediately. Musty wood, old earth, and something faintly sweet beneath, like dried flowers left in a sealed drawer. Time here had not stopped. It had been preserved. He stepped inside. The lobby was small, with a curved reception desk to the right and a set of narrow stairs climbing into the shadows ahead. A brass plaque above the key rack listed room numbers, and Mason's eyes found what he knew he would. Room 3, East Wing, 2nd floor. Only one key was missing. The one for room 3. In its place, a faded note handwritten in thick black ink. Key held by management. Do not release. He walked past the desk and began his climb up the stairs. Each step creaked, but held firm. The air grew colder as he ascended, and the narrow hallway on the 2nd floor stretched out like a photograph from another life. Walls, the color of dried parchment doors, closed along each side, some marked with peeling numbers. Room 3 sat at the far end, its door darker than the others, the grain of its wood knotted and warped like muscle. Mason reached it, placed his palm against the surface. It was warm, like skin. He stepped back, drew in a breath, and pushed. The door opened silently into darkness. Unlike the Pine View, this room had no flickering lamp, no subtle glow. It was black, full, impenetrable, but not empty. He knew that. He could feel the pressure the moment he crossed the threshold. It wasn't air, it was memory. History. Residue. He took a few steps in eyes adjusting. Gradually outlines emerged. A bed, barely a mattress anymore, sagged in the middle like a spine. A dresser stood slanted in the corner. A mirror, tall and cracked, reflected nothing. On the far wall, a single window was boarded shut from the outside. This was the seed, the prototype, the original mold from which room 238 had been replicated again and again. But what had started it? He walked to the mirror. The surface was split down the center, the crack spreading like a jagged bolt of lightning. He leaned in close, and in the glass he didn't see his own face. He saw Lauren, not the version he had just released, a younger one, dressed in white, eyes wide, standing in the middle of the room with something behind her. A shape. Not a person, not quite. A figure of tangled limbs and blankness. It stood still, but it pulsed with meaning. It was the room itself, given form. Watching. Feeding. Waiting. He turned from the mirror, heart hammering. The room was unchanged, empty, quiet. He looked down. At the center of the warped wooden floor was a burn mark. A perfect circle blackened and scorched into the wood. Around it, carvings etched in a language he didn't recognize, swirling patterns, angular slashes, some unfinished, others deepened by repetition. He knelt beside it, brushed away the dust. The symbol from the coin was there. It wasn't just decoration. It was a sigil, a trap, a loop. Someone had drawn it, enacted it, bound something inside, and it had never been erased. The room had remained a doorway, not just to memory, but to something deeper. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the coin. It buzzed softly in his hand, as if responding to proximity. He placed it at the center of the sigil. The floor responded. A tremor ran through the planks, subtle but deliberate, and the darkness thickened. He stood and backed away. The coin began to spin, slowly at first, then faster. The air shimmered warped, and the room opened, not physically, but metaphysically. The walls stretched inward. The boards peeled back like skin, revealing something underneath layers upon layers of old wallpaper, each patterned slightly differently, each soaked with its own history. Mason saw the Pine View, the Red Crest Inn in Texas, the Silverleaf Lodge in Utah. All of them had hosted room 238 in some form. All of them built atop the echo of this very space. He saw faces, people he didn't recognize, guests who had never left. They stared at him through the walls, their mouths moving without sound. And then the door slammed shut behind him. Darkness fell like a curtain, but he didn't panic. He had one more thing to do. He reached for the matchbook in his back pocket, the same one Lauren had used. The last match. He struck it. The flame flickered, then steadied. He held it above the coin, above the sigil, then dropped it. Fire bloomed, but not outward, inward. The floor ignited the burn, racing through the carvings like veins carrying light. The coin melted instantly. The mirror cracked again, this time with a shriek. The walls shuddered. The space around him pulled inward, collapsing on itself, not destructively, but like a hole being sealed shut from the inside. He felt pressure in his ears, a hum, then silence. He stepped back. The fire was gone. The sigil scorched away. The room dimmed, and for the first time since he'd entered it, the air felt clean. He opened the door and walked out. Behind him, room 3 remained, empty, and finally closed. The hallway was darker now than when he'd entered, though the sun hadn't fully set. Mason paused on the threshold, turning his head just slightly, almost expecting the door behind him to vanish or transform. But room 3 remained exactly as he left it. Silent sealed the scorched sigil on its floor like a cauterized wound. The building wasn't groaning or vibrating. The air wasn't thick, and the hallway didn't breathe. Something in that room had finally been severed, and now the rest of the house was just wood and dust. He descended the stairs, slowly taking each step with the weight of someone walking out of a burial chamber. And in a sense, he was. He had walked into the heart of the pattern, the root node of the curse, and lit a match under its tongue. As his boots touched the cracked linoleum of the lobby, the room seemed brighter. Not in color, but in tone. The shadows didn't press so close. The corners no longer whispered. The air had returned to stillness true. Stillness not the predatory kind that waits to pounce, but the kind that follows after an old storm has finally passed. Outside, the wind had picked up. The night had arrived with a sudden hush, and the stars blinked into view, crisp and numerous, unmarred by city lights. Mason crossed the porch and stood on the dirt path, staring out at the broken road leading back toward Red Hill proper. The town behind him no longer pulsed with invisible tension. It simply existed, quiet and inert, like an old story no longer being told. He didn't start walking right away. He stood there for a long moment looking up at the sky. It was strange he hadn't truly looked at the stars in years. Always rushing, always distracted. But now there was time. Something had cleared from him, not just the haunting, not just the guilt, but a fog he hadn't realized had been draped over his life for so long. He could feel the cool air in his lungs like water. It tasted clean, real. Then behind him, the sound of wood creaking. His entire body tensed before he even turned. He pivoted slowly, expecting anything to break the peace. But it wasn't the boarding house. It was a figure sitting quietly on the edge of the porch railing. Lauren, but not quite. She was older now, or maybe just clearer. The version of her that had escaped room 238 was gone freed. This version, if it was her at all, looked worn but grounded. She wore a plain dark coat hair tied back her eyes, tired but soft. "Hey," she said quietly. Mason didn't speak. He approached slowly, cautiously, not entirely sure if she was real or another echo of the pattern trying to hook him one last time. She gestured to the spot beside her. "It's okay. You can sit." He did. The wood creaked beneath them both. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moved through the brush, stirring up fine dust, and a coyote called out in the distance, high and lonesome. Then she said, "You did what I couldn't." "You helped," he replied. "More than you think." Lauren nodded. Maybe. But it needed someone willing to walk through all of it. And to burn it down, even if it meant getting lost. He looked over at her. "Why are you still here?" She didn't smile. Just stared out at the horizon. Some patterns die slow. Pieces linger. I'm not really here in the way you are, but I'm also not gone yet. You unspooled the knot, but there's still tension in the thread. Mason considered this. So what happens now? That's not up to me. You've got the rest of the story now. It's yours. They sat for another minute. Then she stood. "I can't follow you anymore," she said. "That was never my part. But you're not bound to this place. Not anymore." He stood with her. "Will I remember you?" he asked. She reached out, touched the center of his chest. "You'll remember enough." Then she turned, walked down the steps, and began walking into the darkness beyond the edge of the town. Her figure grew smaller, swallowed by distance and shadow. He didn't try to follow. He just watched until she vanished from view. No flicker, no disappearance, just absence. He turned back toward the town. The last light was draining from the sky. He had miles to walk before he'd see another soul, but he wasn't afraid anymore. The motel was behind him. The boarding house was sealed. The coin was melted. The sigil was ash, and room 238 in every form was finally silent. He began walking again, not toward a destination, but away from a past that had finally stopped chasing him. His feet carried him across the dust and rock with slow determination. Each step lighter, each breath easier. And far behind him, in the depths of the old town, the doors of the Red Hill boarding house remained closed. Not locked, just no longer listening. Mason followed the road until it disappeared the cracked pavement, giving way to hard-packed desert and wind-worn trails. No map could guide him now, only memory and instinct. But that was enough. Something deep within him understood the path like a current beneath the soil that pulled him gently forward. Behind him, Red Hill was already fading. swallowed by the dark. No lights, no movement, just the lingering feeling of a chapter finally closed. The moon rose high and round, casting a pale sheen across the desert floor. Shadows grew long and cold. As he walked, Mason's thoughts drifted not to Lauren, not to the boarding house, not even to room 238, but to the moments before all of this began. The subtle discomfort in hotel rooms, the sense of being watched as a child, the sound of knocks that came once, maybe twice, then never again. He had assumed they were dreams, nightmares, but now he understood the room had been with him from the beginning, not as a physical space, but as a story waiting to be told. And he had told it, not with words, but with action, with fire, with sacrifice. Somewhere ahead, he saw the shimmer of headlights. A car. It was parked just off the trail engine, idling, casting long beams of light into the dark. Mason hesitated only briefly before approaching. The driver's window rolled down, slowly revealing an older man with sun-damaged skin and weary eyes. "You look like hell," the man said. Mason smiled faintly. "You should see the other guy." The man chuckled, nodding toward the passenger seat. "You need a lift." Mason glanced behind him once more, then opened the door and slid in. The seat was warm, comfortable. The man shifted the car into drive. "Where are you headed?" Mason stared out the window for a moment, watching the desert slip past, anywhere but back. The driver nodded as if that made perfect sense. They drove in silence for a while, the road unfolding beneath them like a ribbon of memory finally being rewritten. The farther they went, the more distant Red Hill became, not just physically, but spiritually. The knot had loosened. The loop had closed. But Mason knew something else too. The room had existed for more than a century. It had found its way into other structures, other towns. It had left its mark on more people than just Lauren or himself. There would be echoes, remnants, perhaps even copies. But he also knew this. Without the original source, without the boarding house, and the sigil that powered it, those echoes were powerless. Ghosts without a tether, whispers without volume. He leaned his head against the window and let his eyes close. For the first time in what felt like years, sleep came easily. Not the shallow, restless kind that tiptoed on the edge of nightmares, but the deep, dreamless kind. The kind that healed. As the car rolled on through the night, Mason finally rested, and behind him in the dry heart of the Nevada desert, the door to room 3 remained shut, and the story for now was over. Morning came slowly seeping into the sky in gradients of rose and steel. Mason stirred in the passenger seat, blinking against the soft light pouring through the windshield. The car was parked at a roadside diner, a squat building in the middle of nowhere, with flickering neon and a sun-faded sign that read, "Open 24 hours." The air smelled of dust coffee and the faint tang of grease. The driver, whose name Mason still didn't know, was sitting at a booth just inside, sipping from a chipped mug, eyes focused out the window as if he'd been watching over Mason all night. He waved him in without a word, and Mason, stiff but grateful, pushed the door open and stepped into the scent of eggs and old vinyl. "Figured you could use something hot," the man said, sliding a menu across the table. "You slept like the dead." Mason offered a tired smile. Felt like it too. They ordered simple meals, coffee, eggs, toast, the kind of food that didn't pretend to be anything more than what it was. Nourishment, familiarity. It grounded him. Every sip of coffee, every scrape of fork against plate felt like an act of rejoining the world. And for the first time in days, Mason allowed himself to believe it was over. But the world didn't let go so easily. He noticed it first in the woman behind the counter, middle-aged, gray-streaked ponytail, reading a tattered paperback between customers. She was mouthing the words as she read, her lips moving just a second too slowly, like her mind was fighting through something sticky. When Mason stood to refill his coffee, her eyes flicked to him just briefly. For that heartbeat, her expression froze. Recognition fear. It passed too fast to place. He returned to the table. The driver raised an eyebrow. "She see something?" he asked quietly. Mason nodded. "Maybe, I don't know." The man leaned forward. "Sometimes it lingers, like smoke on your clothes. They can smell it even if they don't know what it is." Mason frowned. "You've seen it." The man didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly, carefully, revealing a thin iron key. Old, hand-forged. No label, no teeth. "I had my room once," he said. "It wasn't a motel. It was a cellar in Pennsylvania. Same rules, different shape. Took me years to find the pattern, longer to close it." Mason stared at the key. It looked heavy despite its size. "You kept that?" he asked. The man shrugged. "We don't always get to decide what stays. Sometimes a piece follows you. A reminder. A ward. Or maybe just proof that it wasn't all in your head." Mason hesitated, then reached into his own pocket. He expected to feel the weight of the coin even after melting it in the ritual, but it was gone. In its place was something lighter, a small shard of mirror no bigger than a fingernail, its edges smooth. It pulsed faintly, catching the light in a way that defied logic. The man nodded. "Yours now." Mason stared at it, then closed his hand around the sliver. "You think it's really over?" he asked. The man sipped his coffee. "For you, maybe. For now. But there's always another door." They paid and left without ceremony. The diner shrank in the rearview mirror as they pulled back onto the road, the silence between them, companionable, full of things not needing to be said. After an hour, the man pulled over at a crossroads where a faded bus stop stood next to a broken payphone. "This is where I turn off," he said. "You'll be safe here. Bus comes once a day." Mason stepped out, backpack slung over his shoulder, and nodded. "Thanks for the ride, for not asking questions." The man looked at him through the open window. "You've been through fire. You don't owe anyone an explanation. But if you ever see a red door again, walk away. Don't test it." The car rumbled off, dust swirling in its wake. Mason stood alone at the crossroads, the wind picking up gently, carrying with it the smell of juniper and sun-baked asphalt. He felt the shard of mirror pressing against his thigh inside his pocket, cool and sharp, like a memory too fresh to dull. He didn't know where he was going next, but he knew it wouldn't be a motel. Not for a long time. The bus arrived an hour later. He boarded, paid in crumpled bills, and took a window seat near the back. As the vehicle pulled away, Mason let his head rest against the cool glass. Outside, the landscape rolled by, vast and quiet. Towns came and went. People boarded, sat, stared at their phones, disembarked. But none of them looked at him too long. None of them felt the room on him. Not yet. And as the miles stretched behind him, Mason allowed a new thought to creep in, one he hadn't dared consider until now. What if it was never about ending the pattern? What if it was about carrying it so no one else had to? He stared out at the desert, silent and endless, and in the distance far beyond the range of sight, a single motel sign flickered once, then went dark. The bus rolled on through the desert into twilight, its cabin hushed, vibrating with the rhythm of worn tires against endless highway. Mason leaned against the window, the glass warm from the setting sun. A faint hum from the engine and the low murmur of a radio up front created a background almost hypnotic, like a lullaby for travelers without destination. He didn't know where he was getting off. That wasn't the point. The farther he got from Red Hill, the more weight seemed to lift from his chest, like every mile shaved off a sliver of the pressure that had been living inside his bones. Across the aisle, an elderly woman knitted quietly, her fingers dancing through muscle memory. A few seats up, A young man with headphones bobbed his head to a silent rhythm. Ordinary people, unaware of the ghosts that ride along sometimes. Mason envied them, and at the same time he pitied them. They hadn't seen behind the curtain. They still thought walls were solid, that beds were only beds, that rooms were just places to rest. At a stop somewhere past a gas station that looked carved from the 70s, a teenage girl boarded. She walked past Mason, hesitant, scanning the seats before settling into the one behind him. She didn't speak, didn't shift, just sat with perfect stillness, her bag in her lap, fingers pressed to the zipper, like she was holding something in. Mason didn't think much of it until he noticed the humming, very faint, barely audible. It was the same tune Lauren had hummed in the Pineview that first night. He turned slightly, just enough to glance back. The girl stared forward, not meeting his eyes, but her lips moved in time to the hum, a slow, looping melody that seemed out of place and time. Her bag trembled slightly, not shaking, but pulsing, as if something inside it was moving in rhythm with the hum. Mason faced forward again, heart sinking. He reached into his jacket pocket. The shard of mirror was warm. He gripped it tightly and whispered to himself, "Not again. Not this time." But of course it was. The room had collapsed, yes. The original pattern had been broken. But something had escaped before the seal held. Something small, unfinished. A fragment. And it had found her. The girl didn't hum anymore. Now she was whispering to something or someone. He stood slowly, making his way toward the back of the bus, pretending to stretch to adjust his seat. His eyes flicked to her reflection in the window. Her lips moved, but her expression was blank, like she was reciting rather than speaking. And the words, he couldn't hear them, but he knew the rhythm. He recognized the cadence. It was the invocation. The old script from the archives. The language carved into the floor of room 3. He sat a row behind her now, the hum of the engine masking his breathing. "Hey," he said softly. She stopped, didn't look. He tried again. "Hey, I know what's happening." Her head turned just slightly, enough to catch the light. Her eyes were too dark, not evil, just vacant. Like the part of her that was awake had gone somewhere else. Her lips trembled. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "What's in the bag?" She didn't answer. Mason reached forward, slowly, hand outstretched. "May I?" The girl hesitated, then nodded once reluctantly. He gently unzipped the bag. Inside, resting atop folded clothes and a sketchbook, was a room key. Old brass, no logo, just a number engraved deep into the tag, 238. He closed his eyes. The air around them shifted, not cold but still, intent. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "I found it," she said, "in my grandmother's attic, in a box labeled Things Best Forgotten. I took it as a joke." I didn't think her voice cracked. Mason stared at the key, the engraved numbers glinting. It had crossed state lines. It had survived the fire, the ritual, the collapse. A backup, a copy. No, not even that, a seed. The room had never needed walls, only belief, only acknowledgement. It was a virus of memory, and someone had preserved it. "Listen," Mason said carefully. "You need to let me take it. Okay? It's not yours. It never was. And if you hold on to it, it will open something you don't want to see." The girl didn't resist. She simply nodded. Mason reached into the bag and lifted the key. The moment he touched it, something inside him pulled taut. The shard of mirror burned against his ribs. The air pressed inward, but the key didn't feel powerful. It felt lonely, abandoned, incomplete. He wrapped it in an old bandana and placed it in his pocket. The girl leaned forward. "What happens now?" Mason looked out the window where the sun was setting in deep crimson bands. "We find a place," he said, "and we bury it. Really bury it this time. Not in fire, not in salt, but in forgetting." She stared at him. "Can we?" He didn't know. but he nodded anyway. The bus rolled on, and somewhere far from the road and its sleepers, the bones of a room shifted once more. The bus reached a dusty little town just past midnight. One blinking streetlight, one closed diner, one gas station still lit from within. The driver announced a short rest stop, just enough time for passengers to stretch or breathe, or pretend they weren't carrying the weight of invisible things. Mason and the girl stepped off together, the night air cool and still. The road was silent, except for the occasional buzz of insects and the low thrum of something deeper, like a heartbeat, buried under the asphalt. They didn't speak for a while. She sat on the bench, arms wrapped around her knees. Mason paced a few yards away, the wrapped key heavy in his coat pocket. The shard of mirror still tucked in his shirt vibrated softly, as if aware of the presence nearby. He knew this wasn't over, not until the last trace was gone. He pulled out the key and unwrapped it. In the flickering light of the gas station, the brass tag glinted dull gold. The numbers 238 had faded slightly, but they were still there, etched with impossible precision. He ran his thumb across them, feeling the grooves. This wasn't just an object. It was a memory turned solid. A mnemonic device for a space that should never have existed. The girl, her name was Lena, he'd learned, watched him. If we throw it away, it'll come back, won't it? Yes, Mason said simply. If we burn it, it'll return somewhere else. If we bury it shallow, someone will find it. But there's another way. She raised her eyes. What? We forget. She furrowed her brow. What do you mean? He walked to a nearby trash can, not to throw the key away, but to examine it. Steel rim, deep cavity. Above it, a battered sign advertising fuel discounts and old lottery results. No cameras, no attention, just enough neglect to hide something. Mason turned back to Lena. The room lives on memory. It needs people to remember the number, the space, the rules. But if we can bury it inside someone who forgets, truly forgets, it'll fade, lose its grip. She looked frightened now. You mean, forget it ourselves? No, he said. Me. I'll carry it, and I'll let it slip away. She stood. But how do you forget something like this? He hesitated, then pulled the shard from his shirt and held it to the light. The reflection shimmered strangely, off-sync, delayed. He turned it, catching her image in the surface. But her reflection wasn't her. It was Lauren. Same age, same eyes, just for a flash. Then it was gone. Mason understood. The mirror was more than a remnant. It was a doorway. One last tether to the old pattern. But it could also be a lock. A keyhole. He pressed the shard to his palm until it bit into skin. Blood welled around it, thin and red. He dropped the wrapped key into the can and closed the lid. Then he whispered, "I give it to the forgetting." The shard pulsed. The world flickered just for a second and then steadied. The pressure eased. He turned back to Lena. She blinked at him. "Who are you?" Mason tilted his head. "What do you mean?" She looked genuinely confused. "Were you on the bus earlier? I'm sorry." "I thought I don't know. I must be tired." Mason's breath caught. It had started. The forgetting. He smiled gently. "It's okay. Get some rest." The driver called them back, and Lena boarded without another glance, already forgetting the hum, the key, the conversation. Mason stood a moment longer beneath the street light. He no longer remembered where the journey had started. Not fully. There were gaps now, intentional absences forming in his mind like peeled paint on an old wall. He remembered a room, a door, a name. But the details were slipping, unraveling, losing weight. And with that forgetting, the room lost shape. It was becoming what it had always hated to be, nothing. He stepped back onto the bus. This time he didn't sit near the back. He chose the middle, neutral ground. As the bus rolled on into deeper night, Mason closed his eyes and let the last fragments dissolve into the hum of the tires and the soft breathing of strangers. He dreamt of quiet places, of doors that never opened, of keys that rusted into soil and were never spoken of again. The bus hummed quietly through the dark hours, carrying its passengers like seeds drifting on the wind, each of them wrapped in dreams or silence. Mason didn't sleep this time, not out of fear, but out of instinct. He sat with his hands in his lap, fingers slack, eyes half-lidded as the countryside blurred past in soft grays and distant silhouettes. Something inside him had emptied, and the absence was peaceful. At dawn, the bus pulled into a small depot on the edge of a mountain town, cooler air, the smell of pine and damp soil replacing desert dust. Mason stepped off with the rest, his feet meeting the ground like they belonged to someone else. Lena passed by him without recognition, earbuds in her gaze forward. A stranger again. He watched her disappear into the misted light, then turned and walked toward the edge of town. The mirror shard no longer pulsed. It rested silently in his coat, inert now, a keepsake of a memory he couldn't fully place. He no longer recalled Red Hill in detail, couldn't quite bring up the faces. Even the number on the key, he saw it blurred in his mind like ink washed with water. He reached the edge of a forest trail and stopped. Below, a river ran through granite and moss. He stood on a boulder beside the path and opened his coat, pulling out the shard. It was cold again, ordinary, just glass now. No reflection in its surface, no hum, just silence. He drew back his arm and flung it into the trees. It arced once, caught the light, and vanished into the underbrush without a sound. No burst, no omen, no ripple in the world. Just gone, Mason exhaled. And for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, he felt weightless. He turned from the woods and began walking toward town. A sign pointed toward a local library, a place to rent cabins, and a general store. He had money in his pocket, clothes on his back, nothing urgent behind him, no room hunting him, no pattern pressing in. Maybe it would last, maybe it wouldn't, but for now he was just a man on a road. No ghosts, no watchers, no more rooms, only a path and a choice. If you're still here drifting gently at the edge of sleep, know this: some stories aren't meant to terrify. They're meant to remind you of the thin line between the world we live in and the one that lives just beside it. The room under the bed, the reflection that lingers too long, the door that opens just slightly when no one's home. They're not always real, but they feel that way because we carry pieces of them inside us. Tonight's story has been a long one. You've followed Mason across states, through mirrors, inside shadows. You've heard the hum, seen the outline touch the key, and yet through it all, you've stayed with him, with me, with this quiet unraveling of a tale best left half forgotten. Let that final image settle now, a road ahead clean and unwritten, the weight finally lifted, a breath taken, not stolen, a sleep earned, not invaded. You're safe now. The room is closed, the key is gone, and the shadows for tonight have nowhere left to go. So gently now release whatever's left in your chest. Let the quiet take its shape again. Let the dark be only night, not a story waiting to unfold. You've done enough. Rest easy, drift deeper. I'll be here again when the next room calls.